She was invited to her billionaire ex-husband's Thanksgiving party and showed up in a $700 million jet with the twins he never knew existed. The Gulfstream G650 descended through pewter clouds above Manhattan, its sleek nose cutting through the December sky like a silver blade through silk. Inside the private cabin, Renee Carter pressed her forehead against the cool window, watching the city that had once crushed her dreams spread out below like a glittering chessboard where she'd lost every piece, or so everyone believed. Before we continue this extraordinary story of revenge served at 30,000 feet, I want to thank each of you, our incredible 900-strong Mr. Steele Rich Stories community. Your support means everything, and if this story moves you, please hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear about second chances, and subscribe to join our family of truth seekers and story lovers. Manhattan hadn't changed, still wearing its crown of glass and steel, still pulsing with the heartbeat of 8 million ambitions. But Renee had transformed completely. 5 years ago, she'd fled this city with nothing but a broken engagement, empty bank accounts, and the kind of humiliation that makes headlines in society pages. Today, she returned as someone else entirely. The mysterious RC who'd built a fashion empire from shadows, whose designs graced runways from Milan to Tokyo, whose identity remained the best-kept secret in an industry that thrived on gossip. The invitation had arrived at her Kyoto office 3 weeks ago, delivered on ivory cardstock so thick it felt like destiny itself. Damien Cross's annual Thanksgiving gala at Hudson Hall, the same man who'd been her fiancé, the same venue where their engagement party had been held, the same world she'd abandoned when he chose her best friend over her in the cruelest way possible. Some would call returning to such a scene masochistic. Others might whisper about unfinished business. But Renee understood something deeper. Sometimes you have to walk back through hell wearing better shoes to prove the flames never really touched you. And she had reasons for returning that no one, not even Damien with his Wall Street intuition, or Victoria with her predatory instincts, could have predicted. Her phone buzzed against the leather armrest. James, her business partner and the only person who knew her complete truth, had sent a simple message: the arrangements are confirmed. They're waiting at the St. Regis. The word carried weight that would soon shift the entire foundation of New York society, because Renee wasn't returning alone, and she wasn't returning as just the discarded woman who once served coffee to fashion photographers, hoping someone would notice her portfolio. She was returning as a mother to 5-year-old twins whose existence would shatter every assumption, every rumor, every carefully constructed lie that had flourished in her absence. The pilot's voice crackled through the cabin speakers, announcing their approach to Teterboro. 20 minutes until landing. 20 minutes until her new life collided with her old one. Renee opened her laptop, reviewing the acquisition papers one final time. Her father's company, the empire built on her mother's family recipes, the business that should have been her inheritance. Before Victoria convinced their parents that Renee was too creative, too unfocused to handle corporate responsibility. The irony tasted expensive now. While Victoria had spent 5 years bleeding the company dry with her vanity projects and Damien's failed investment schemes, Renee had quietly built something larger. RC International didn't just compete with luxury brands, it had started acquiring them. The lawyers had kept her identity hidden behind shell companies, and NDAs so ironclad that even the FBI would struggle to penetrate them. Tomorrow, at the gala, the announcement would go public: RC International's hostile takeover of her family's company. The prodigal daughter bought back her birthright with interest. But the business victory was merely the frame. The real masterpiece would be the moment when Alexander and Lily walked into that ballroom, 2 children with Damien's unmistakable grey-green eyes and their mother's delicate features. 2 secrets she'd carried beneath her wedding dress on that horrible day, discovered only after Damien had already chosen Victoria. 2 reasons she'd never fought for him, never begged, never even explained. Because how do you tell a man who just publicly humiliated you that you're carrying his children? How do you trust someone who looked at your best friend during your engagement party and decided she was the better investment? The answer was simple: you don't. You disappear. You give birth alone in a Swiss clinic. You build an empire while raising babies who ask why daddy never visits. You wait until you're strong enough that returning isn't about winning him back. It's about showing him what he lost. Renee closed the laptop and pulled out a different document, the custody agreement her lawyers had drawn up. Damien didn't know he was a father, but New York law would recognize his obligations. The papers were perfectly prepared, waiting only for the right moment of revelation. She wasn't seeking revenge through the courts. That would be too simple, too clean. She wanted him to see his children's faces across a crowded ballroom, to understand in one crushing instant that his choice 5 years ago had cost him not just a fiancé, but a family. The jet banked left, beginning its final descent. Below, the Hudson River carved its ancient path between New Jersey and New York, indifferent to human drama playing out in the towers flanking its shores. Renee thought about her mother, dead 3 years now, never knowing her grandchildren because Victoria had convinced her that Renee's abandonment of the family meant exile from everything, including final goodbyes. That grief had crystallized into something harder than diamonds, more valuable than any fashion empire. Her reflection in the window showed a woman she barely recognized. Gone was the eager-to-please girl who'd spent hours designing party favors by hand, who'd believed love meant compromise and family meant loyalty. The woman staring back wore Hermes-like armor and wielded silence like a weapon. Her hair, once long and soft, was cut in a severe bob that framed features sharpened by purpose rather than surgery. She'd learned languages, mastered industries, navigated parenthood alone, all while the New York society pages occasionally wondered whatever happened to poor Renee Carter. They'd have their answer tomorrow night. Every gossip columnist, every society matron, every former friend who'd chosen Victoria's version of events, they'd all understand that exile was just another word for metamorphosis. And Damien would learn that when you break someone at their engagement party, choosing their best friend in front of 200 witnesses, you better make sure they stay broken. Because if they rebuild themselves into something stronger, your reckoning arrives wearing couture and carrying documentation that transforms everything you thought you knew about your own life. The landing gear deployed with a mechanical whisper. Renee pulled out her compact, checking her appearance one final time. Perfect lipstick, perfect composure, perfect plan. The twins were at the St. Regis with their nanny, probably bouncing on hotel beds despite strict instructions for good behavior. Tomorrow, she'd dress them in matching custom pieces, a fortune spent. On children's clothes, they'd likely spill juice on within an hour. But image was everything in this return engagement. Every detail had been orchestrated for maximum impact, from the timing of the takeover announcement to the way she'd enter the ballroom precisely when Damien would be giving his annual toast. 5 years ago, she'd run from this city with her dignity in ruins and her heart hemorrhaging. Tomorrow, she'd walk back into its most exclusive venue with 2 beautiful secrets, and enough corporate ammunition to reshape her entire family's legacy. The invitation might have been meant as a cruel reminder of what she'd lost, but Renee had transformed it into something else entirely, a stage for the kind of revelation that would echo through Manhattan's corridors of power for generations. As the jet touched down on the rain-slicked runway, Renee smiled for the first time since receiving that ivory invitation. Victoria thought she'd won everything worth having. Damien believed he'd chosen the better woman. Her father assumed his empire would pass to Victoria's future children. They were all about to learn that sometimes the person you dismiss, discard, and forget is precisely the one you should have feared most. Because Renee Carter hadn't spent 5 years healing, she'd spent them becoming someone who didn't need to heal. Someone who transformed wounds into wealth, betrayal into billions, and abandonment into an advantage so complete that by the time her enemies recognized the threat, she'd already won. The engines powered down. Outside, a black Bentley waited in the private hangar, ready to carry her back into the life she'd once fled. But this time, she wasn't returning as Renee Carter, the discarded fiancée. She was returning as something far more dangerous, a mother with nothing left to lose and everything already gained. Tomorrow would bring tears certainly, shattered champagne flutes probably, Damien's world imploding, definitely. But tonight she would tuck her children into bed at the St. Regis, order room service champagne, and watch the city lights from a suite that cost more per night than she'd once made in a month. Tonight she would savor the anticipation of Damien's face when he realized that the greatest love of his life had been walking around his city in miniature, duplicate form, two perfect echoes of what could have been his future, raised by the woman he'd abandoned for a mirage. The Bentley door opened. Renee stepped onto American soil for the first time in 5 years. The city that broke her was about to learn what she'd built from the pieces. She settled into the leather seats, the door closing with the kind of solid thunk that only German engineering and excessive wealth could produce. The driver, a professional who'd been briefed to expect silence, pulled smoothly onto the private road that would take them from Teterboro into Manhattan proper. Renee allowed herself to close her eyes for just a moment, centering herself before the storm. The twins would be awake when she arrived. Elena never could get them to sleep. Before 8, no matter how many parenting books suggested earlier bedtimes, Alexander would want to hear about the flight, about the clouds, about whether she'd seen any other planes. Lily would want to be held, would curl into her mother's arms and ask if tomorrow was the day they'd meet the man from the pictures. Yes, baby. Tomorrow, you meet your father. The man who doesn't know you exist. The man who chose someone else and never looked back to see what he was leaving behind. The city rose around them as they crossed into Manhattan. First the industrial edges, then the residential neighborhoods. Finally the glittering commercial districts where wealth concentrated like gravity, pulling everything toward its center. This was Damien's world, the kingdom he'd built after walking away from her. Cross Industries occupied 3 buildings in Midtown, employed 4,000 people, and generated enough revenue to fund small nations. But Renee had learned something in her 5 years of exile. Money was just a tool, and the person who understood how to use it most effectively wasn't always the one with the most of it. She'd built RC International with strategic precision, every acquisition calculated, every expansion planned 3 moves ahead. While Damien had been buying buildings, she'd been buying the companies that designed them, that furnished them, that created the aesthetic that made them desirable in the first place. Tomorrow night, when the announcement broke, he'd understand that she hadn't just survived, she'd won. Not by his metrics of success, but by her own. She'd created something beautiful and powerful and entirely hers, something that no one could take away, because it existed in her vision, her talent, her refusal to let heartbreak define her limitations. The St. Regis emerged from the Manhattan landscape like a cathedral to old money, its facade promising discretion and luxury in equal measure. The Bentley pulled smoothly to the entrance where a doorman appeared instantly, opening her door with practiced grace. Miss Carter, welcome back to New York. She accepted the greeting with a nod, stepping onto the sidewalk where she'd once walked as a different person in a different life. The lobby embraced her with familiar grandeur. She'd stayed here before, years ago, when Damien had brought her to the city for the first time, when everything had seemed possible and love had felt like the only empire worth building. How naive she'd been. How beautifully, destructively naive. The elevator carried her to the suite where her real treasures waited. She could hear them before the door even opened. Alexander's excited voice explaining something with the intensity only 5-year-olds brought to subjects they found fascinating, Lily's occasional interjections adding details her brother had forgotten. Elena opened the door, her face creasing into the smile reserved for people she genuinely loved, rather than merely tolerated. They've been asking about you every 10 minutes. I tried to explain that planes take time, but patience isn't their strongest quality. They get that from their father, Renee said, then stopped, surprised she'd said it out loud. Elena's expression shifted to something knowing and sad. Tomorrow, then. Tomorrow. The twins appeared in the doorway, pajamas already on despite it being barely 7 o'clock, clearly the result of Elena's strategic parenting. Alexander launched himself at Renee with the full-body commitment of someone who believed his mother could catch anything. Lily followed more carefully, but her grip was just as fierce once she'd attached herself to Renee's leg. "Mama, "Did you see the chocolate shop downstairs? Elena said maybe tomorrow we could get some if we're good." "We're being so good, Mama. The best good ever." Renee knelt down, gathering both children close, breathing in the scent of hotel shampoo and the specific sweetness that belonged only to her babies. This was what mattered, not tomorrow's revelations or business victories, or the look on Damien's face when he realized what he'd lost. Just this, two small humans who loved her absolutely, who'd given her purpose when purpose seemed impossible to find. "You're always good," she whispered into their hair. "Tomorrow's going to be a big day. Are you ready? We get to wear our fancy clothes," Lily said seriously, "and meet lots of people, and be very polite even when we're bored. And we get to meet him," Alexander added, his voice dropping slightly. "The daddy who didn't know about us." The simplification was both accurate and heartbreaking. Renee pulled back, looking at her son's face. So like Damien's, it sometimes hurt to look at him directly. "Yes, baby, you get to meet your father. And remember what we talked about? He might be happy, or he might be scared, or he might be lots of things all at once," Alexander recited. "And we're supposed to let him feel his feelings while we feel ours." 5 years old, quoting the child psychologist Renee, had consulted for 3 months before deciding to return to New York. 5 years old, preparing to meet a father who'd never read him a bedtime story, or checked for monsters under his bed, or taught him to tie his shoes. But that was going to change. One way or another, after tomorrow, Damien Cross would know his children existed. And then he'd have to decide what kind of father he wanted to be, the absent kind, or the kind who showed up late, but showed up fighting to make up for lost time. Renee spent the rest of the evening in the particular chaos that only small children could create in expensive hotel rooms. There were baths and stories and negotiations about how many more minutes until lights out. There was Alexander's detailed analysis of every plane he'd seen from the window, and Lily's fashion critique of the curtains, which she declared pretty but impractical because they don't block enough light for good sleeping. Finally, mercifully, they slept. Renee stood in the doorway of their bedroom, watching their small chests rise and fall, their faces peaceful in a way that made her throat tight. She'd done this alone for 5 years. Every midnight fever, every nightmare, every milestone celebrated with just Elena and James as witnesses. She'd been enough for them, because she'd had to be enough. But tomorrow, that changed. Tomorrow, their family expanded whether Damien wanted it to or not. Tomorrow, the truth came out, and nothing would ever be the same again. Renee returned to the living room where Elena sat with tea, waiting. The older woman had been with her since the twins were 6 months old, had seen Renee at her worst, and loved her anyway, had become the grandmother these children deserved even without blood connection. "Are you sure about this?" Elena asked quietly. "It's not too late to turn around. Go home. Keep your peace." "I'm sure," Renee replied, though sure felt like too small a word for the complex certainty driving her forward. "He deserves to know. They deserve to know him. And I deserve to stop carrying this secret like it's something shameful instead of the best thing that ever happened to me." Elena nodded, accepting the answer even if she didn't entirely agree with it. "Then I'll be here. For whatever you need, for whatever happens. Those babies are mine too, in all the ways that matter." "I know," Renee said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. Later, alone in her own room, Renee stood at the window watching Manhattan glitter below. Somewhere out there, Damien was probably in his office, working late because that's what he did, what he'd always done. Work had been his first love, his truest commitment. She'd been foolish to think she could compete with that devotion. But their children, they were half him, carried his DNA whether he acknowledged it or not. Maybe they'd be the thing that finally taught him there were prizes in life. That couldn't be won through hostile takeovers and strategic acquisitions. Maybe they'd break through the armor he wore and find the man she'd once loved underneath. Or maybe not. Maybe he'd look at them and see only complication, only obligation, only the disruption of the carefully controlled life he'd built in her absence. Either way, she'd know. After tomorrow, she'd finally know what kind of man she'd loved. What kind of father her children had, What kind of future they were all walking into. Renee climbed into bed, setting her alarm for early. She'd need time to prepare, to dress, to transform herself into the version of Renee Carter that could walk into that gala and change everything. The city hummed beyond her window, 8 million people living their lives, unaware that tomorrow at Hudson Hall a story would conclude and begin simultaneously. A woman would face the man who broke her, a father would meet the children he never knew existed, and a truth 5 years in the keeping would finally be told. Sleep came slowly, but when it did, Renee dreamed of runways and ballrooms, of twins in matching clothes, of a man's face transforming from shock to wonder to something that might, eventually, become love. Tomorrow would tell her if dreams and reality could ever occupy the same space. Tomorrow would change everything. The first winter in Denver nearly killed her, not metaphorically, but literally. 7 months pregnant with twins, Renee had arrived at Union Station with 2 suitcases and a bank account that wouldn't survive past month's end. The rental car's heater had died somewhere outside Aurora, and she'd driven the last 40 miles wrapped in every piece of clothing she owned, her belly pressed against the steering wheel, tears freezing on her cheeks before they could fall. That was the night she'd fled New York, the engagement party still ringing. In her ears, Damien's speech about finding the one while looking at Victoria instead of her, the gasps from the crowd, the way her best friend had smiled like she'd won a prize she'd been competing for all along. Renee had left before the cake was even cut, before the official announcement, before she had to watch him slip a ring on Victoria's finger in front of everyone they knew. 3 days earlier, she'd taken a pregnancy test in his penthouse bathroom. 2 pink lines, then another test, then a third, because surely the universe couldn't be that cruel to give her his children right before he chose someone else. But the universe didn't operate on fairness, and by the time she'd confirmed, with a doctor that yes, twins, yes, healthy, yes, approximately 6 weeks along, Damien had already made his choice clear in 1,000 small ways that added up to one devastating truth. He loved Victoria, not her. So Renee had done the only thing that made sense to a woman whose entire world had just collapsed. She'd run. Denver in January was brutal. The garage apartment in Highlands Ranch had been advertised as a cozy mountain retreat. Translation: 400 square feet with pipes that screamed at 3 in the morning and a landlord who considered heating an optional luxury. Renee had paid the deposit with cash from selling her engagement ring, not the one Damien had given her because he'd never actually gotten that far, but the promise ring from years earlier, when love had still felt possible. Those first weeks, she'd survived on instant ramen and stubbornness, too proud to call her parents, too broken to admit that. Victoria had been right about one thing. She really had no idea how to survive without the safety net of family money. The trust fund she'd always had access to was suddenly frozen. Her father, his lawyers citing family concerns about her erratic behavior, Victoria's influence, obviously, poisoning even that last resource. The public clinic in Commerce City became her second home. Surrounded by other women whose circumstances had brought them to free healthcare, Renee learned. That humility came in plastic chairs under lights that made everyone look exhausted. The nurse practitioner, a woman named Dolores with hands that had delivered half of North Denver, took one look at Renee, his designer bag, the last luxury item she hadn't sold, and said, "Honey, that purse isn't going to raise those babies. You got a plan?" A plan. Renee had fled New York with nothing resembling a plan. But sitting in that clinic, feeling 2 hearts beating beneath her own, she understood that plans were luxuries for people whose lives hadn't exploded. What she needed was simpler: survive today, then tomorrow, then string enough tomorrows together until it resembled a future. The fashion design software on her laptop became her lifeline. While other pregnant women nested, Renee coded. She'd taught herself CAD programs through YouTube tutorials, staying awake until her eyes burned, designing collections that would never see fabric while her babies somersaulted inside her. The freelance work started small: $50 to fix a pattern here, $100 to sketch concepts there. She posted on forums under the initials RC, building a reputation pixel by pixel while her body built humans cell by cell. Labor came during a March blizzard that shut down I-25. Renee drove herself to the hospital, contractions hitting every 4 minutes. The Honda Civic she bought for $800 sliding across black ice while she screamed into the emptiness. 23 hours later, Alexander arrived first, silent until the doctor coaxed life into his lungs. Lily followed 12 minutes after, so small the NICU team was already waiting. The birth certificate sat blank for 3 days. Father's name, a line that seemed to mock her from the official paper. She could have written Damien Cross, could have started a legal battle from her hospital bed. Instead, she left it empty. Some truths were too expensive to tell, and she had no money left for expensive truths. The twins spent 3 weeks in NICU while Renee lived in the hospital family lounge, existing, on cafeteria coffee and whatever the nurses smuggled her from their break room. She pumped breast milk every 3 hours, labeled bottles with medical precision, and used the quiet moments between feedings to email clients, building her business from a chair designed to comfort people whose worlds were collapsing. When they finally came home, Alexander at 4 pounds 12 ounces, Lily barely 4 pounds, Renee discovered that single motherhood with premature twins was its own particular challenge that parenting books never adequately addressed. They ate every 2 hours, tag-teaming their hunger, so she never slept more than 45 minutes at a time. The garage apartment's thin walls meant every cry echoed to neighbors who left passive-aggressive notes about consideration for working people. She developed systems born of desperation. Design work happened during the 4 in the morning feeding when the twins dozed against her chest in their discount bouncy chairs. Client calls were scheduled during their one predictable nap, white noise machines creating a sound barrier she prayed would hold. She wore the same milk-stained shirt for 3 days straight, learned to type one-handed while bottle, feeding, and discovered that dry shampoo could extend hair washing to a once-weekly luxury. The breakthrough came 6 months later, through pure accident. A client had commissioned a gown design, then vanished without paying the invoice. Furious and exhausted, Renee posted the design on Instagram at 2 in the morning, tagged every fashion influencer she could think of, and passed. Out with both babies in her bed, a co-sleeping arrangement every pediatrician warned against, but which remained the only way anyone slept at all. She woke to 47,000 likes and an inbox full of purchase inquiries. The design, a deconstructed gown that looked like heartbreak dressed in silk, had gone viral overnight. Someone had tagged it the dress every woman wants to wear to show her ex what he lost, and the internet had embraced it. By noon, she had orders worth $300,000 and absolutely no way to fill them. That's when she met David Park, a textile manufacturer from Los Angeles, who'd been among the first to message. He flew to Denver, took one look at her situation, babies crying, laptop balanced on a milk crate, fabric samples, spread across a floor that hadn't been vacuumed in weeks, and made an offer that changed everything. "I'll handle production and fulfillment," he said, stepping over a pile of laundry to reach the only chair that wasn't broken. "You design. We split profits 60-40, your favor. But I want exclusive manufacturing rights to the RC brand for 3 years." She negotiated while breastfeeding. Alexander latched on one side while she reviewed contracts with her free hand. David, father to 4 kids himself, didn't even blink. The deal they struck that afternoon would eventually make them both wealthy beyond measure, but that day it simply meant Renee could afford formula to supplement feeding and maybe, finally, hire help. The first nanny lasted 3 days before declaring the twins unusually spirited and quitting via text message. The second stayed a week. The third, a grandmother named Elena from El Salvador, took one look at the chaos, said something in Spanish that probably wasn't complimentary, rolled up her sleeves and stayed. 4 years later, she was still there, the closest thing to family Renee had in Colorado. With Elena's help, Renee could finally work more than stolen minutes. The designs poured out like water breaking through a dam, years of suppressed creativity, mixed with sleep deprivation and heartbreak, creating something entirely new. Her aesthetic wasn't pretty or safe. It was armor disguised as evening wear, power dressed up as elegance. Women understood it. Instinctively, they ordered pieces that cost more than their monthly rent because they were wearing RC meant wearing survival itself. The first million came 18 months after the twins were born. Renee stared at the bank balance for 20 minutes, certain it was an error. When the reality settled, she didn't celebrate with champagne or expensive dinners. She hired a better lawyer, incorporated properly, and moved to a 2-bedroom apartment where the heating worked consistently. Luxury was relative. Hot water that didn't run out mid-shower felt like winning the lottery. Year 2 brought corporate interest. Neiman Marcus wanted exclusive pieces. Bergdorf Goodman requested a private showing. Renee flew to meetings with breast milk stored in hotel freezers, conducting million-dollar negotiations while secretly Googling whether the twins' developmental milestones were normal. Alexander had started walking at 10 months, running by 11, climbing everything by his first birthday. Lily, smaller and quieter, didn't walk until 14 months, but spoke incomplete. Sentences by 18 months, narrating their lives with startling clarity. "Mama works" became Lily's favorite phrase, usually said while pointing at Renee hunched over her laptop at 11 at night. It was accusation and observation combined, a toddler's way of marking absence even in presence. The guilt ate at her worse than exhaustion. Every trip to New York or Los Angeles meant leaving them with Elena, returning to accusations disguised as tantrums. Alexander would ignore her for hours after she came back, punishing her with the cold shoulder only a toddler could perfect. Lily would cling like static, afraid to let go in case Mama disappeared again. But the business grew regardless, feeding on her desperation to provide everything Damien's absence had stolen. Private preschool tuition that cost more than her former annual salary. Health insurance that covered everything without questions. A college fund that would let them choose any university without checking price tags. She was building them a fortress made of money, each dollar a brick between them and the vulnerability she'd experienced. Year 3 brought the kind of success that required infrastructure. RC International incorporated in Delaware for tax purposes, with offices in Denver, Los Angeles, and eventually Milan. Renee hired aggressively, young designers who reminded her of herself before Damien, hungry and talented and willing to work passionate hours for a chance at greatness. She paid them fairly, remembering her own years of unpaid internships, and created the kind of mentorship she'd never received. The twins grew alongside the empire. Alexander, with his father's sharp features and his mother's determination, became obsessed with numbers, counting everything, arranging toys in perfect patterns, solving puzzles meant for children twice his age. Lily, delicate as her name suggested but tough as Colorado winters, developed an eye for color that was almost supernatural. At 3, she could identify fabric quality by touch alone. They never asked about their father initially. Elena and Renee were their world, complete and sufficient. But as they approached 4, the questions started. Why didn't they have a daddy like kids at school? Why was their family smaller than everyone else's? Renee had practiced answers that were truthful without being cruel, but nothing prepared her for Alexander's matter-of-fact declaration one evening, "Daddy didn't want us, so we don't need him." She'd cried that night after they were asleep, grieving for the simplicity they'd lost before they'd ever had it. But by morning, she'd transformed that grief into determination. They were right. They didn't need Damien. They had each other. They had Elena. They had a life built on their mother's refusal to let heartbreak be their inheritance. Year 4 brought acquisition offers. Luxury conglomerates circled like sharks, smelling blood in the water of independent success. LVMH offered $500 million. Kering countered with $750 million plus a board seat. Renee refused them all, building instead through strategic purchases of struggling brands she could revive. The fashion press called her the mystery magnate, this RC who appeared at numbers parties, gave no interviews, existed only in the clothes that bore her initials. The Colorado house came that year, 6 bedrooms overlooking Red Rocks, with a studio where she could work while the twins played in the pool. Elena moved into the guest house, becoming an official family in all but blood. They created their own traditions, Sunday pancakes where flour covered every surface, Tuesday movie nights, where they all piled into Renee's bed, Friday art projects that usually ended with paint in someone's hair. It was during one of those art sessions that the invitation arrived, forwarded from her office to her home. The ivory envelope sat on her kitchen counter like a grenade with the pin pulled. Alexander had grabbed it first, recognizing letters but not words yet, asking, "What's this, Mama?" She'd read it while Lily painted her brother's face with washable markers, an activity that was definitely going to end in tears, but which bought her 30 seconds of stillness. Damien Cross's 5th annual Thanksgiving Gala. Hudson Hall. Black tie preferred. The audacity of it stole her breath. That they'd tracked down her address. That they'd included her, like she was just another potential guest who might want to celebrate his success. But there was more. A handwritten note on heavy cardstock, Damien's distinctive handwriting, that she'd once loved seeing on birthday cards and random love notes. Renee, I've heard whispers about RC International and recently confirmed my suspicions about the brilliant mind behind the brand. It would mean a great deal to me if you'd attend. There are things left, unsaid between us, and perhaps this could be an opportunity for closure, or conversation, or whatever you'd be willing to grant. I think of you often, and wonder if you've found the happiness you deserved. D. Elena found her an hour later, sitting on the bathroom floor while the twins napped, invitation crumpled in her fist. The older woman said nothing, just sat beside her on the cold tile, waiting. Finally, Renee spoke. He wants closure. He thinks he can invite me to his party and tie up loose ends like I'm a business deal. He forgot to finalize. So don't go, Elena said simply. I have to, Renee replied, though she couldn't fully explain why yet. The obligation felt cellular, like returning to the scene of an accident to finally understand the physics of collision. He needs to know about them. They deserve to know him, and I deserve to stop carrying this secret like it's something shameful, instead of the best thing that ever happened to me. That night, after bedtime stories and whispered love yous, Renee sat in her studio surrounded by 5 years of success, and made a decision. She wouldn't attend as the victim they expected. She'd return as something they couldn't have imagined, not just successful but untouchable, carrying secrets that would rewrite their entire narrative. She started planning that night, not revenge exactly, but revelation. The difference mattered, though she couldn't have explained why. Revenge was emotional, messy, driven by hurt. Revelation was clean, precise, driven by truth. And the truth was that Damien had children he'd never known existed, that Victoria had stolen a life built on incomplete information, that everyone who'd chosen sides 5 years ago had chosen based on carefully curated lies. The twins were the truth that would shatter everything. Not weapons, but witnesses to what could have been if Damien had stayed. If he'd loved her enough to ignore whatever poison Victoria had whispered, if he'd been the man she'd thought she was marrying instead of the coward who chose easier love over real love. But more than that, the twins were proof that the best things in her life had come from the worst day she'd survived. Every success, every achievement, every moment of joy with her children, all of it grew from soil poisoned by betrayal. Damien and Victoria thought they'd destroyed her. Instead, they'd freed her to become someone magnificent. Over the following weeks, Renee prepared with military precision. She had the twins meet with a child psychologist who specialized in complex family situations, ensuring they understood as much as 5-year-olds could understand about meeting a father who didn't know they existed. She had her lawyers draft custody agreements that protected her children while allowing Damien access if he wanted it. She coordinated with David about the timing of the acquisition announcement. Her family's company would officially become hers the morning of the gala, the news breaking just hours before she walked into that ballroom. She also did something she hadn't done in 5 years. She looked at photos of Damien. Not the professional headshots that appeared in business journals, but the personal ones she'd kept, hidden in a folder on her laptop labeled Old Tax Documents, where she'd never accidentally stumble across them. There he was at the cabin they'd rented in Vermont, laughing at something she'd said, snowflakes caught in his hair. There they were at her first gallery showing, his arm around her waist, pride evident in every line of his body. There he was asleep on her couch, vulnerable and young and entirely hers, except he'd never really been hers, had he? Victoria had been there all along, waiting in the wings, playing the long game while Renee had foolishly believed that love was enough. And when the opportunity had presented itself, when Damien had needed someone to understand his business pressures, his family expectations, his fear of commitment, Victoria had positioned herself as the solution while subtly painting Renee as the problem. It worked beautifully. By the time of the engagement party, Damien had already made his choice. The public declaration had just been formality, the final humiliation in a relationship. That had been dying for months, while Renee had been too in love to notice the symptoms. But looking at her children now, Alexander with his father's laugh, Lily with his stubborn determination, Renee couldn't regret any of it. Yes, the heartbreak had nearly destroyed her. Yes, the years of struggle had been harder than anything she'd imagined surviving. But these two perfect humans existed because of that pain, and she wouldn't trade them for any alternate history where Damien had chosen her and they'd built a different life together. The night before leaving for New York, Renee stood in her studio looking at the dress she'd designed for the gala. White, like the one from the viral post that had launched her career. But elevated, silk that cost more per yard than most people spent, on entire outfits, beading that had taken 3 artisans 4 weeks to complete, a silhouette that suggested both strength and grace. She would wear this dress into Damien's world and show him exactly what he'd lost. Not just a talented designer or a loving partner, but the mother of his children, the woman, who'd survived his abandonment and built something beautiful from the ruins he'd created. Tomorrow, she'd board that plane. Tomorrow, she'll return to New York. Tomorrow, she'd change everything. But tonight, she was just Mama, reading bedtime stories about brave princesses who saved themselves, tucking in 2 children who believed she could do anything because she'd never given them reason to doubt it. "Mama," Lily whispered in the darkness, "what if he doesn't like us? Then he's missing out on knowing the 2 most amazing humans I've ever met," Renee whispered back. "And that's his loss, not yours." "But what if he does like us?" Alexander asked from his bed across the room. "Then we'll figure out what that means, together, as a family. Because that's what we do. We figure things out together." Satisfied, they settled into sleep, trusting her completely, breaking her heart and healing it simultaneously with their absolute faith that Mama would handle whatever came next. And she would. She'd handled everything else, hadn't she? Tomorrow would just be one more thing to survive, to master, to transform into something that served her purpose rather than someone else's narrative. The city that broke her was about to learn an important lesson. Women who rebuild themselves from nothing don't break the same way twice. The 42nd floor of Cross Industries Tower contained exactly 3 things at 11:47 p.m. Damien Cross, a glass of 30-year-old Macallan, and the kind of silence that cost $20 million per floor to achieve. Outside, Manhattan writhed with its usual nocturnal energy, but here, sealed behind triple-paned glass that could stop bullets and heartbreak with equal efficiency, the city might as well have been a screensaver. Damien stood at the window, watching lives play out in miniature far below. Taxis threading through streets, couples stumbling from bars, regular people living regular lives with regular problems that didn't require board approval or SEC filing. He envied them with the specific ache of someone who'd gotten everything he'd wanted only to discover the price tag was written in a currency he hadn't known he was spending. The whiskey burned familiar paths down his throat, dinner again replaced by alcohol that cost more than most people's rent. His personal chef had given up calling 3 months ago, tired of preparing meals that went untouched. The nutritionist had lasted longer, 6 months of concerned emails about his declining weight, until Damien had simply stopped responding. What was the point of perfect health when you had no one to stay healthy for? His phone sat silent on the massive oak desk that had once belonged to a railroad baron. 16 missed calls from various executives, all of which could wait until morning or forever. The only call he actually wanted would never come. She'd made that clear 5 years ago when she'd looked at him across that horrible engagement party and simply left. No screaming, no scene, no dramatic confrontation, just absence where she'd been standing, and then absence everywhere, forever. Renee, even her name felt like archaeology now, something discovered in layers, of memory he'd tried to bury under acquisitions and expansions. She'd been right to leave, of course. She usually was right about things that mattered. He'd chosen Victoria over her, not because he'd loved Victoria more, but because Victoria had been easier. She'd understood his ambition, had encouraged his worst impulses, and had never asked him to choose between her and the empire he was building. Renee had asked him to choose, not explicitly, but in 1,000 small ways. Date nights he'd cancelled for meetings, weekends sacrificed to deals, the way she'd looked at him when he'd explained again that he couldn't make her art. Gallery opening because Tokyo was 12 hours ahead and the merger couldn't wait. She'd never said, "Choose me," but the request had been implicit in every disappointed smile, every understanding nod, every time she'd said it's okay when they both knew it wasn't. So he'd chosen the path of least resistance. Victoria, who wanted the prestige of being with him more than she wanted him, who'd never ask him to be present because she was too busy building her own ambitions on the foundation of his success. It had seemed logical at the time, efficient even. Two people who could coexist, in parallel rather than the messy intersection that real love required. Except it had been a disaster. Slowly, then catastrophically. The engagement had lasted 8 months before the cracks became canyons. Victoria's spending had spiraled from excessive to pathological. Her jealousy, which he'd initially found flattering, had revealed itself as something darker, the need to destroy anything that threatened her position. She'd poisoned his relationships with friends, with family, with anyone who'd known him before and might remind him of who he'd been. The final straw came when he discovered she'd been systematically sabotaging the family company she'd inherited through her best friend's absence, Renee's family business, the one Victoria had somehow gained control of after Renee had fled. She'd been bleeding it dry deliberately, transferring assets to Shell, companies, running it into the ground not for profit but for spite. Because even with Damien, even with everything she'd wanted, Victoria couldn't stand that Renee had built something without her. He'd ended the engagement 2 years ago. Quietly, with NDAs and financial settlements that had cost him 8 figures to avoid public scandal. Victoria had taken the money and disappeared to Europe, occasionally surfacing in society pages with various wealthy men who all looked vaguely similar, ambitious, distracted, emotionally unavailable. Men like him, Damien realized with uncomfortable clarity. The Thanksgiving gala planning had started 8 months ago, his executive assistant Caroline treating it like a military campaign. 500 guests, each selected for their strategic value. Senators who could smooth regulatory paths. CEOs who controlled supply chains. Influencers who could shift public perception with a single post. Every invitation was a chess move. Every please reply a small victory in games that never ended. But tonight, staring at the final guest list, Damien felt the weight of what it didn't contain. Not a single real friend. Not one person who'd known him before the Forbes articles and Fortune 500 designation. His parents were dead, his father from a heart attack at his desk, his mother 6 months later. From what the doctors called complicated grief, but what Damien knew was simply giving up. His brother lived in Seattle, running a small architecture firm, politely declining every invitation with excuses that had evolved from believable to perfunctory. "You've become someone I don't recognize," James had said during their last phone call 3 years ago. "And I'm not sure you recognize yourself either." Damien had hung up rather than argue, but the words had burrowed deep, surfacing at moments like this when the whiskey lowered his defenses and the silence grew teeth. He walked to his desk, pulling up the RSVP tracking system Caroline had designed. Green dots for confirmed attendees. Yellow for maybe. Red for declines. The screen looked like a chaotic abstract painting, festive and false. His eyes caught on one name, Renee Carter. The please reply was still pending, the invitation delivered 3 weeks ago to RC International's New York office. He'd debated for months whether to send it, whether reaching out would be cruelty disguised as closure or genuine attempt at reconciliation. In the end, he'd handwritten a note, something he never did for anyone, and sent it before he could overthink himself into paralysis. The response had been silence, which was, he supposed, its own kind of answer. Caroline had figured out 6 months ago that RC was Renee. She'd presented him with a folder of evidence, design aesthetics that matched Renee's old portfolio, business decisions that reflected her specific blend of creativity and ruthlessness, photographs from Milan Fashion Week, where a woman in the background, face carefully angled away from cameras, had Renee's distinctive profile. The folder had sat on his desk for 2 weeks before he'd opened it, afraid of what confirmation would mean. When he'd finally looked, it had been like seeing a ghost rendered in corporate documents and financial statements. She'd done it. She'd built exactly the kind of empire she'd always dreamed of building, the one she'd tried to explain to him over late-night conversations when he'd been too focused on his own ambitions to really listen. And she'd done it without him, which meant she'd never needed him in the first place. That realization had hurt worse than the breakup, not because his ego required her to need him, but because it meant every moment they'd shared, every plan they'd made, had been built on the faulty foundation of his assumption that he was essential to her success. He'd thought he was doing her a favor by letting her go, by choosing Victoria and freeing Renee to find someone who'd prioritize her properly. Instead, he'd just revealed his own smallness, his inability to see that love wasn't about hierarchies of need, but about choosing to show up even when it was inconvenient, especially when it was inconvenient. Victoria had taught him that lesson through her absence of real feeling. Every relationship since has reinforced it. But by the time he'd learned it, Renee was gone, and all the money and power he'd accumulated couldn't buy her back. The office felt smaller suddenly, the walls pressing in despite the square footage. Damien grabbed his jacket, custom-tailored, naturally, cut to perfection by someone who'd measured his body but never asked about the soul wearing it. The private elevator descended in silence, carrying him down through layers of his own making, each floor representing another year of climbing toward a summit that kept receding. The garage held 12 cars he never drove, the Bugatti gathering dust, the vintage Mustang he'd bought to recapture something from his father's stories about youth and freedom, now just another possession that possessed him instead. He chose the least conspicuous option, a black Tesla that drove itself while he sat in the back, another passenger in his own life. The city passed in streams of light. He had no destination, just movement for its own sake. The algorithm chose routes based on traffic optimization, turning when efficiency demanded, stopping when lights required. Damien wondered if this was what his life had become, an algorithm optimizing for success metrics while missing the entire point of the journey. His phone buzzed. Caroline, working despite the hour because that's what people in his orbit did. They matched his inhuman schedule or got replaced by someone who would. Tomorrow's schedule is confirmed. Breakfast with the Samsung executives at 6 a.m. Board meeting at 8. Lunch with the Secretary of Commerce at noon. The London conference call at 3. Gala final walkthrough at 5. He didn't respond. What would he say? That he'd rather have breakfast alone in a diner somewhere, reading an actual newspaper instead of market reports? Those board meetings felt like theatre where everyone knew their lines, but no one remembered why they were performing? That the gala he'd spent months planning suddenly felt like an elaborate exercise in proving to himself that he had everything except the things that mattered. The car pulled up outside a small bar in the East Village, the algorithm, apparently deciding his aimless journey needed a destination. Damien hadn't been here in 15 years, not since business school when he and his study group would celebrate surviving another week of cases and cold calls. The neon sign still flickered, the same struggling bulb creating the same erratic pattern. Inside, nothing had changed. The same sticky floors, the same bartender who might have been there since the Kennedy administration, the same booth in the back where he'd once sketched his first business plan on napkins while his classmates told him he was crazy to think that big. They'd been right about the crazy part, just not in the way they'd meant. He ordered a beer, domestic, nothing special, and sat in that same booth. The napkin dispenser was still overstuffed, still offering blank canvases for dreams that hadn't yet calcified into reality. Damien pulled one out, grabbed a pen from his pocket. Without thinking, he started writing. Not business plans or strategy documents, just words. Things he missed, things he'd traded, things he'd thought he'd have time for later. Sunday mornings with someone who steals the crossword, badly cooked dinners that taste perfect because of the company, arguments about what movie to watch, someone who knows how you take your coffee without asking. Thanksgiving with actual thanks to give. Renee's laugh when she thought something was genuinely funny, not politely amusing. The list grew, each line an admission of absence. The beer went warm, forgotten. Around him, regular people lived their regular lives, complaining about bosses and bills and bad dates, not knowing that. The man in the $1,000 suit would trade places with any of them for just one day of their ordinary problems. His phone buzzed again. The Tokyo markets were opening. The yen was fluctuating. Decisions needed to be made. Damien looked at the screen, then at his list, then made a decision that would have horrified his board of directors. He turned the phone off completely. For 1 hour, Cross Industries could survive without him. The empire could stand unguarded. The deals could wait. He sat in that booth, drinking warm beer and remembering when success had been a destination instead of a prison, when ambition had been fuel instead of addiction. The bartender appeared. Decades of experience reading the specific exhaustion of the wealthy. Another? No, Damien said. Just the check. On the house, the bartender replied. You look like someone who just realized money can't buy the things that matter. Damien laughed, a sound so foreign he almost didn't recognize it as coming from his own throat. That obvious. Son, I've been serving drinks since before you were born. I've seen every species of misery there is. Yours is the expensive kind, costs everything and gives you nothing back. The truth of it sat between them, undeniable. Damien left $100 bill anyway, not as payment, but as acknowledgement. The bartender pocketed it without comment, understanding the language of generous tips as apology for existences that demanded witnesses. Outside, the Tesla waited, patient as a hearse. The ride back to his penthouse took 12 minutes, each one counted. By the clock on the dashboard, marking time he'd never get back. The doorman nodded. The elevator rose. The penthouse door opened to darkness that knew him intimately. Damien didn't turn on the lights. He walked to his home office, smaller than the corporate one but no less empty, and sat in the darkness, thinking about the gala, about Renee, about the invitation she hadn't answered. Maybe she wouldn't come. Maybe she'd moved on so completely that his attempt at reconnection was just another sign of his inability to let go of things that were never his to keep. Maybe the best thing he could do was leave her alone, let her continue building her empire without the complication of his regret contaminating her success. But part of him, the part that still remembered who he'd been before ambition had consumed everything else, hoped she'd come. Hoped she'd walk into Hudson Hall and give him the chance to say the things he should have said 5 years ago. That she'd been right, that he'd been a coward, that choosing the easier path had cost him the only relationship that had ever made him want to be better than he was. The city below continued its relentless motion, lives intersecting and diverging, stories beginning and ending, while he watched from his tower of glass and ambition. In 2 days, 500 people would gather in his name, toasting his success, celebrating his achievements, pretending they knew him when really they only knew his net worth. But maybe, just maybe, one person would see through the performance to the man desperately hoping someone could. Teach him how to transform success back into satisfaction, how to turn gold back into dreams worth having. He'd know in 2 days. Either Renee would come, and he'd have his chance at redemption, or she wouldn't, and he'd have his answer about whether some bridges, once burned, could ever be rebuilt. Either way, the gala would happen. The toasts would be made. The business would continue. The empire would stand. And Damien Cross would remain exactly what he'd built himself into, the richest, loneliest man in New York, surrounded by everything except the one thing he actually wanted. November 28th arrived wearing storm clouds that matched the mood of every reporter stationed at Teterboro Airport since dawn. The annual Cross Industries Thanksgiving Gala had become the kind of event where arrivals mattered almost as much as attendance, who flew in with whom, which designers dressed which moguls, whose absence spoke louder than presence. But no one was prepared for what descended through those pewter clouds at 3:47 p.m. The aircraft didn't just land, it announced itself. The Gulfstream G700, not yet commercially available, one of only 3 prototypes in existence, touched down with the kind of precision that made seasoned pilots weep. The $700 million price tag wasn't just for luxury, it was for the statement that someone had arrived who didn't just travel first class, but redefined what first class meant. News vans scrambled into position. Photographers elbowed for angles. The Bloomberg reporter started live streaming before the engines even cooled. Her voice pitched with the specific excitement of witnessing something unprecedented. Ladies and gentlemen, we're watching something extraordinary here at Teterboro. This aircraft, this is beyond private aviation. This is someone making clear they're playing in a league of their own. Inside the aircraft, Renee Carter applied the final touch of lipstick while Alexander pressed his nose against the window, counting planes on the tarmac. Lily sat beside her, small fingers tracing the beading on her dress, a miniature version of her mother's custom design that had cost more than most people's annual salaries, but would probably end up stained with chocolate before the night ended. 17 planes, Mama, Alexander announced, his 5-year-old voice carrying the authority of someone who'd been counting since he could talk. But ours is the biggest. Size isn't everything, baby, Renee replied, though she appreciated the prototype's impact. David Park, her business partner, had arranged the loan of the aircraft through connections that ran deeper than money. Sometimes it's about arrival timing. Remember what we practiced? Both children straightened, their faces shifting into the careful composure she'd taught them. Not to hide who they were, but to protect themselves from a world that would devour their innocence if given the chance. They were 5 years old, carrying secrets that could reshape New York society, but to her, they were just her babies playing dress-up in clothes that cost more than their entire nursery had 5 years ago. Before we continue with this moment that would change everything, I want to pause and ask you, our incredible Mr. Steele Rich Stories family, what would you do if your past met you at 30,000 feet? If you had to face the people who broke you while protecting the treasures they never knew existed? Share your stories in the comments below. Your courage inspires these tales, and your voices matter more than you know. The aircraft door opened with hydraulic precision. Renee emerged first, and the collective intake of breath from the assembled media was audible even over the wind. She wore white, not bridal white, but the white of absolution, of someone who'd already survived their judgment day. The coat alone, a custom piece from her own collection, would launch 1,000 imitations within the week. But it was her composure that stunned them most, the way she descended those steps like she was granting an audience rather than making an entrance. Then came the children. Alexander first, his hair styled back revealing features that would make gossip columnists scramble through archives, trying to place those distinctive grey-green eyes. Lily followed, delicate as spun glass but with a smile that suggested she knew exactly what kind of disruption she represented. They flanked their mother with practiced precision, tiny hands gripping hers with trust that made several hardened photographers lower their cameras, recognizing something sacred in the moment. Who is she? The whispers started immediately, rippling through the crowd like electricity through water. The aircraft registration traced back to shell companies within shell companies. The children's existence had never been documented in any society pages. This was someone who'd hidden in plain sight, or perhaps hidden so well that sight had never been plain at all. Renee walked past the cameras without acknowledging them, though she knew every angle. They were capturing every shot that would appear on tomorrow's front pages. Alexander stayed close to her right side, his eyes taking in everything with the intensity of someone cataloguing threats and exits. Lily waved once, a tiny gesture that would become infamous, the wave of a child who didn't yet understand she was waving goodbye to anonymity. The Bentley waited exactly where specified, the driver someone she'd hired personally rather than trusting to chance. Trust was a luxury she couldn't afford, not when her children were involved. As they settled into the leather seats, Lily asked the question that had been building since they'd left Denver. "Mama, will he be there? The man from the pictures?" Renee had shown them photos 6 months ago, age-appropriate explanations about why some families looked different than others. Damien's face in those images, younger, unmarked by whatever these 5 years, had carved into him, had meant nothing to them beyond mild curiosity. But tonight, that face would be real, would be in the same room, would perhaps finally understand what his choice had cost and created simultaneously. "Yes, baby, he'll be there. Will he want to know us?" Alexander's question carried no hope, just pragmatic assessment from a child who'd learned early that wanting and having occupied different universes. "I don't know," Renee answered honestly. She'd never lied to them about difficult truths, just filtered them through language they could digest. But that's his choice to make, not ours. We're complete with or without him. The drive from Teterboro to Hudson Hall took 40 minutes through pre-holiday, traffic that moved like molasses, despite the police escorts that mysteriously appeared. Another arrangement she hadn't made but suspected came from David's network of people who smoothed paths for those who could afford smooth paths. The children watched Manhattan pass outside their windows, this city that lived in their mother's stories but had never been their reality. Hudson Hall rose from the landscape like something from another era when wealthy men built monuments to their success that would outlast their names. Damien Cross had restored it to its Gilded Age glory, every detail authentic to the period, except for the hidden technology that made it functional for modern events. The parking area already contained a fortune in vehicles. Lamborghinis parked next to Rolls-Royces, Teslas beside classic Ferraris, each one a declaration of its owner's particular flavor of success. But the prototype Gulfstream had already done its work. Every phone inside that hall was buzzing with images, speculation, theories about who had arrived with such spectacular intention. The children's faces had been captured, but not yet identified, though several. People were noting the boy's unusual eyes, the girl's distinctive grace. Pieces of a puzzle that would soon create a picture no one was prepared for. Renee helped her children from the car, adjusting Alexander's bow tie, smoothing Lily's hair. They looked like catalogue perfection, but she saw the truth, Alexander's nervous habit of tapping his thumb against his fingers, Lily's slight tremble that meant she was overwhelmed but trying to be brave. They were 5 years old, about to walk into a room full of their father's world, and she wondered if she was protecting them or using them. The entrance to Hudson Hall was designed to impress. 30-foot doors that opened onto a foyer that could have housed most people's entire homes. But Renee had walked through grander doors in Milan, Tokyo, Paris. She'd learned that architecture was just dressed up in security, that the bigger the doors, the smaller the man who needed them. Caroline, Damien Cross's assistant, waited just inside, her professional smile faltering slightly at the sight of the children. The guest list hadn't mentioned +2s of this variety, but she recovered quickly, extending a hand that Renee shook with precisely calibrated pressure, firm enough to establish equality, gentle enough to suggest no threat. "Miss Carter, Mr. Cross is delighted you could attend. He asked me to personally ensure you have everything you need." The formality felt appropriate for this choreographed revelation. Renee had built her response carefully, polite, professional, giving nothing away yet. "These are my children," Renee said simply, not offering their names yet. That would come later, when the moment was calibrated for maximum impact. "I trust that won't be a problem?" "Of course not," Caroline replied, though her eyes were already calculating. trying to solve the equation of a fashion mogul mysterious enough to intrigue. Damien Cross arriving with children who looked like they'd stepped out of a luxury advertisement, but whose parentage remained unclear. They were led through corridors lined with actual Rembrandts and Monets, past security so subtle it was almost invisible, toward the main ballroom, where 500 of New York's most powerful were, already 3 drinks deep into conversations that shaped economies. The children walked between them, Alexander's hand in Renee's right, Lily's in her left, a small battalion preparing for battle. The doors to the ballroom were closed, the sound of symphony music and cultured laughter seeping through like promises of the world inside. Renee paused, kneeling down to her children's level, making sure they understood what was about to happen. Remember what we talked about. This is Mama's work, but you're my most important job. If you get scared or tired or just want to leave, you tell me immediately. Nothing in that room matters more than you two feeling safe. They nodded solemnly, and she saw Damien in Alexander's determined jaw, in Lily's lifted chin. Genetics were cruel that way, marking children with the faces of people who'd never read them bedtime stories or checked for monsters under beds. Caroline opened the doors, and the ballroom revealed itself in layers. First the space, overwhelming in its grandeur, crystal chandeliers casting light. That made everyone look like they were filmed through the most expensive filters. Then the people, faces Renee recognized from business journals and society pages, from the life she'd once desperately wanted to join. And finally, at the far end of the room, standing alone near the bar with a glass of champagne he wasn't drinking, was Damien Cross. 5 years had changed him. The boyish energy that had once made her overlook his workaholism had hardened into something more austere. Success suited him the way expensive suits suited mannequins, perfect from a distance, empty up close. He hadn't seen her yet. The room was too full, the entrance too subtle. But that would change. Victoria was nowhere visible, a detail that surprised Renee. She'd expected them to be together, expected to have to face both betrayals simultaneously. The absence felt like a missing piece in a puzzle she'd spent 5 years assembling. Renee would circle the room first, let the children be noticed, let whispers build into waves. And then, when Damien was approached by enough people asking about the mysterious woman in white, with 2 angelic children, when curiosity had built to critical mass, she would approach. Not for confrontation, not for the kind of scene that would feed gossip columns for months, but for truth, delivered as gently as a blade between ribs, letting him understand that every choice created consequences that compounded. Like interest, that walking away from her at that engagement party had meant walking away from futures he'd never known existed. Alexander tugged her hand, pulling her from her strategic planning back to the immediate present. "Mama, there's a chocolate fountain." The words, so perfectly 5-year-old in the midst of all this orchestrated drama, made her laugh. Real laughter, not the practiced society version she'd perfected, but the kind that came from recognizing that no matter how much she planned, children would always find the chocolate fountain first. "We'll get some later, baby. First, let's go meet some people who are going to be very surprised to meet you." They entered the ballroom properly then, and heads began to turn. The white dress was recognized first. Several fashion editors immediately identified it as an RC original, wondering how this woman had accessed a piece from a designer who never sold to individuals. Then the children drew attention, their obvious careful training and composure, marking them as belonging to this world even as their faces remained unfamiliar. Renee moved through the crowd with practiced ease, accepting champagne she wouldn't drink, making conversation that revealed nothing while suggesting everything. The children stayed close but not clingy, trained through years of occasional public appearances to be present, without being disruptive. Several women asked their names. She deflected with the skill of someone who'd learned that information was currency, not to be spent carelessly. "What beautiful children," a woman in Chanel said, her eyes sharp with curiosity. "How old are they?" 5, Renee replied, the number loaded with implications for anyone doing math. "And their father?" In this room, Renee said simply, then moved on before the woman could process the revelation. The whispers started in earnest then. A woman, mysterious and wealthy enough to arrive in a prototype aircraft. 2 children, 5 years old, clearly expensive and well-bred. A father in this room, which meant someone present had a secret that was about to become very public. The speculation would be delicious for those who fed on such things. Renee could almost hear the mental calculations. Which men had been unaccounted for 5 years ago? Who'd had relationships that ended mysteriously? Whose timeline would accommodate secret children? And all the while, she felt Damien's presence like gravity, pulling her toward the moment when their eyes would meet across this room full of people who thought they knew his story, his success, his perfectly controlled life. None of them knew about the pregnancy test hidden in her purse the day he'd chosen Victoria. None of them knew about the nights she'd spent in a Denver hospital NICU, watching machines help her babies breathe. None of them knew that the RC they'd been discussing, the mysterious fashion force reshaping their industry, was the same woman they'd dismissed as the heartbroken ex-girlfriend who'd fled rather than face her humiliation. But they would know soon. Truth had a way of emerging at parties like this, where alcohol loosened tongues and proximity made secrets impossible to keep. And Renee had brought the biggest truth of all, wrapped in designer clothes, and holding her hands with trust that made every sacrifice worthwhile. She was positioning herself near the chocolate fountain, because Lily's patience had limits, and those limits had been reached when she felt the shift in the room that meant someone important had noticed something significant. She turned slightly, and there he was. Damien Cross, frozen mid-conversation with a senator, his champagne glass suspended in air, staring at her like he was seeing a ghost rendered in flesh and silk, an impossible reality. The senator kept talking, oblivious, but Damien wasn't listening anymore. His entire focus had narrowed to Renee, to the recognition that she'd actually come, that she was actually here, that the invitation he'd sent half hoping and half dreading had been accepted. Their eyes met across 30 feet of ballroom, across 5 years of silence, across the chasm of everything that had been broken and never repaired. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath, everyone sensing drama without yet understanding its source. Then Lily, bored with adult tension she couldn't decode, announced loudly enough to carry, "Mama, is that him? The one from the pictures?" The question landed in a temporary lull in conversation, carrying further than it should have, reaching ears that were already primed for scandal. Heads turned. Connections started forming. A woman with children, 5 years old, asking about someone from pictures. And Damien, still frozen, still staring, now looking at the children with a dawning horror of someone who was beginning to understand that the past didn't stay buried just because you stopped thinking about it. Those choices made in moments created consequences that lasted years. That the woman he'd let go had been carrying secrets that would have changed everything. If he'd only asked, if he'd only stayed, if he'd only chosen differently. Renee smiled, not warmly, not coldly, just the smile of someone who'd finally reached the moment they'd been planning for, dreading, anticipating, and was now committed to seeing through regardless of cost. She took her children's hands and began walking toward him, each step measured, each movement calculated for maximum impact. The crowd parted instinctively, sensing they were witnessing something that would be discussed for years, that would reshape their understanding of Damien Cross and the empire he'd built on the foundation of choices that were about to be re-examined. Alexander and Lily walked beside her, perfect and innocent and devastating in their existence. The truth incarnate, about to shatter a man's carefully constructed world. And Renee, the woman who'd been broken and rebuilt herself into something stronger, was about to deliver the revelation that would change everything. The collision happened near the orchestra, between the second movement of Vivaldi and a waiter's dropped tray that created just enough distraction for fate to operate unnoticed. Renee had been moving toward Damien with deliberate slowness, children in tow, when the distance between them finally collapsed to nothing. Damien Cross stood 3 feet away, holding champagne he'd forgotten to drink, his expression cycling through confusion, recognition, and something that looked dangerously close to hope. The years had carved themselves into his face, lines around his eyes that spoke of too many screens, too little, sleep, and the specific exhaustion of getting everything you'd wanted except the thing you'd needed. Renee. Her name in his mouth was a question and an answer simultaneously. Not a greeting, but a confirmation that she was real, that she'd actually come, that the past 5 years of her absence were ending in this exact moment. His voice carried the weight of everything unsaid, everything that had festered in silence. "Hello, Damien." The simplicity of it belied the earthquake happening beneath. Alexander and Lily stood perfectly still, sensing adult drama with the radar children developed when raised by observant single parents. The orchestra continued playing, waiters continued serving, conversations continued, flowing, but for approximately 10 seconds, the universe contracted to just this: two people who'd known each other before armor became necessary, meeting again after they'd both been forged into weapons. Damien's gaze dropped to the children, and Renee watched him do the math every person in this room would soon be doing. 5 years old. The timeline that would rewrite every assumption about why she'd disappeared, about what had really happened at that engagement party, about why she'd vanished from New York like smoke. His face went through several transformations in rapid succession: confusion about why she'd brought children to his gala, then careful observation of their features, then the slow, creeping realization that was almost physically painful to witness. The grey-green eyes that mirrored his own, the shape of Alexander's jaw, the way Lily tilted her head when she was thinking, exactly the way he did. "These are my children," Renee said, her voice steady though her pulse hammered traitorously. Alexander and Lily. The words hung between them, simple and devastating. Damien's champagne glass began to shake slightly, the liquid trembling, in concentric circles that betrayed what his face was trying to hide. He set it down on a passing waiter's tray with deliberate care, the kind of careful movement people made when they were afraid they might shatter if they moved too quickly. "Children," he repeated, the word testing itself in his mouth. His eyes kept moving between Renee and the twins, searching for confirmation or denial, for anything that would make this make sense. Alexander, ever protective of his mother, stepped slightly forward. "Are you Damien Cross? Mama said we'd meet you here." The directness of childhood, the simple question that demanded a simple answer, seemed to break through Damien's paralysis. He knelt without hesitation, bringing himself to their eye level with instinct that suggested he understood, on some fundamental level, that this moment required him to be smaller, more accessible, less intimidating. "Yes," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "I'm Damien. It's an honor to meet you both." "You have sad eyes," Lily announced, because 5-year-olds hadn't learned that truth was supposed to be dressed up or hidden. "Like Mama's when she thinks we're sleeping but we're not really." The observation landed like a physical blow. Damien's composure cracked visibly, his face contorting with something between grief and wonder. He looked up at Renee, the question written plainly across his features, even if he couldn't quite voice it yet. "How old are you?" He asked the children, though Renee knew he was really asking her, really, demanding confirmation of what he was beginning to understand. 5, Alexander answered promptly. "We had our birthday in March. Mama made us a cake that looked like a castle, and it was chocolate inside, even though the outside was decorated like stone. It was the best cake ever." March. 5 years ago. 6 weeks after the engagement party where Damien had chosen Victoria and Renee had fled. The timeline writing itself in real time across Damien's face as he processed, calculated, understood. He stood slowly, his attention returning to Renee with an intensity that made her remember why she'd been careful to avoid him all those years ago. Damien Cross had always seen too much, understood too quickly, and reached conclusions that others missed. Even now she could watch him piecing together the story, the pregnancy she'd hidden, the reason. She'd left without fighting, the empire built on necessity rather than ambition alone. "We need to talk," he said. Not a question, but not quite a demand either. "Privately. The children will be perfectly safe with Caroline." He gestured to his assistant, who appeared with the efficiency of someone used to reading her employer's unspoken needs and current emotional crisis. She has 3 kids of her own. They'll probably have a better time with her than watching adults have difficult conversations. Lily looked at Caroline with the assessment of someone who'd had many babysitters and had developed criteria for evaluation. "Do you know where the chocolate fountain is?" "I know everything about the chocolate fountain," Caroline replied seriously, understanding the assignment, "including where they keep the strawberries that aren't on display yet." That settled it. The children went willingly, leaving Renee with no excuse as Damien gestured toward the French doors that led to the terrace. She could feel eyes following them. 500 people recognizing that something significant was happening, that Damien Cross was abandoning his own gala to speak privately with a mysterious woman who'd arrived with children who looked disturbingly like him. The November air was sharp enough to cut through shock. The city spread below them, lights beginning to twinkle as evening claimed the sky. The terrace was empty except for them, designed for moments exactly like this, private conversations that required witnesses to be absent. Damien waited until the doors closed behind them before speaking, and when he did, his voice was barely controlled. "Are they mine?" The question hung in the cold air, desperate and terrified in equal measure. Renee could have played games, could have made him suffer for the asking, but she was suddenly exhausted by strategy and performance and the weight of carrying this secret for 5 years. Yes. The single word detonated between them. Damien's knees seemed to give slightly, and he gripped the terrace railing with white-knuckled intensity, as if the stone was the only thing keeping him upright. His breathing had changed, shorter and sharper, the physical manifestation of a world reorganizing itself around new, impossible information. 5 years, he said. Not quite a question. "You've known for 5 years that I had children, and you never—" He stopped, unable to finish, unable to articulate the magnitude of what he was processing. "I found out 3 days before the engagement party," Renee said, her voice steady despite the tears that threatened. 2 pink lines on a test I took in your penthouse bathroom while you were meeting with Victoria about the party details. I was going to tell you that night, after the party. I had this whole plan about how to share the news, how to celebrate, how to start planning our future as parents." She paused, letting him absorb it, letting the timeline reconstruct itself in his mind. "And then you stood up in front of 200 people and announced that you'd realized Victoria was the one you wanted to spend your life with, that you'd been confused, that you'd made a mistake with me, that you were sorry for wasting my time, but you'd found your real love." The words came out clinical, factual, stripped of the emotion they'd carried for 5 years. "So no, Damien, I didn't tell you, because watching you choose her broke something in me that required me to protect my children from being the reason you stayed in a relationship you clearly didn't want." "That's not," he started, but she cut him off. "You made your choice. You chose her, chose the easier path, chose the woman who didn't challenge you to be better than you were. And I chose not to trap you with an obligation you'd resent, not to raise children with a father who stayed out of duty instead of love." The tears were falling now, despite her determination to remain composed. 5 years of holding this in, 5 years of making this decision over and over in her mind, justifying it, defending it, believing it was right even when it felt impossibly hard. Damien was crying too, silent tears that tracked down his face unchecked. "I have children," he said, the words sounding like prayer and curse combined. 5 years old. 5 years I've missed. First words, first steps. First of all, Alexander walked for 10 months, Renee said, not knowing why she was offering these details, except that they seemed important and seemed like the bridge between past and present. Lily took longer, 14 months, but she spoke in full sentences by 18. They both love strawberries, but hate blueberries. Alexander sleeps with a nightlight shaped like the moon. Lily insists on exactly 3 bedtime stories, no more, no less. She was cataloguing their lives, offering him pieces of the children he'd never known. And with each detail, Damien's face crumpled further, the weight of absence crushing him visibly. "Why now?" he asked. Why come back now? Why tell me at all if you managed 5 years without me? Because they started asking questions I couldn't answer forever. Because they deserve to know their father, even if he doesn't deserve to know them. Because I'm tired of carrying this secret like it's something shameful instead of the best thing that ever happened to me. The honesty was brutal, necessary. They stared at each other across the terrace, across 5 years of silence. Across the chasm of everything that had been broken and never repaired. I ended it with Victoria, Damien said suddenly, the confession tumbling out. 2 years ago. The engagement was a disaster from start to finish. She wasn't. He stopped, laughing bitterly. It doesn't matter what she was or wasn't. I chose wrong. I chose the easiest path instead of the right one, and I've spent 5 years understanding exactly how catastrophically I failed. This isn't about Victoria, Renee said quietly. This is about them, about Alexander and Lily, and what kind of father you want to be now that you know they exist. The question hung between them, fundamental and unavoidable. Damien looked through the glass doors to where the children were visible, laughing with Caroline over something. At the chocolate fountain, completely unaware that outside their entire future was being negotiated. I want to know them, he said, his voice breaking. I want to be their father, if you'll let me. If they'll let me. I know I have no right to ask, no claim to make after abandoning you. You didn't abandon us, Renee interrupted. You never knew we existed. You abandoned me, yes, but them. You can't abandon children you don't know about. The distinction seemed important. The line between what he was guilty of and what he wasn't. Damien absorbed it, nodding slowly. What happens now? He asked. Now we go back inside. Now you meet your children properly, as their father, instead of as a stranger at a party. Now you start showing up, consistently, reliably, proving that you can be what they need instead of just promising it. And you? The question carried weight beyond the immediate logistics. Renee understood what he was really asking, whether there was any possibility of them rebuilding, what had been destroyed, of becoming something more than Xiao parents navigating shared custody. I don't know, she said honestly. Right now, I need to focus on them, on making sure this transition doesn't hurt them. Everything else is secondary. Damien nodded, accepting the boundary even as disappointment flickered across his face. Can the first hug you? He asked quietly. Just once, just to... He couldn't finish, couldn't articulate what the gesture would mean. Renee stepped forward, allowing herself to be pulled into his arms for the first time in 5 years. He held her like she was made of glass and grief combined, his face buried in her hair, his whole body shaking with silent sobs that felt like release and devastation braided together. I'm so sorry, he whispered against her hair. For all of it, for not choosing you, for not being there, for missing everything that mattered. I know, she whispered back. I know. They stood like that for a long moment, two people who'd loved each other, once, mourning what had been lost and what could never be recovered. Then Renee pulled back, wiping her eyes, reconstructing the composure that had carried her through the evening. They're waiting, she said, gesturing toward the ballroom. Your children are waiting to meet you properly. The words seemed to steady him. Damien wiped his own face, straightened his jacket, transformed back into the man who commanded boardrooms and built empires. But his eyes remained red-rimmed, his hands still trembling slightly as he opened the terrace doors. The ballroom had continued without them, but the energy had shifted. Everyone knew something significant had happened on that terrace, and the speculation was reaching fever pitch. When Damien and Renee entered together, every conversation paused mid-sentence. Caroline appeared with the children, both of whom had chocolate on their faces and looked deliriously happy. They ran to Renee, then stopped, looking at Damien with new curiosity. Are you our daddy? Lily asked. The question so simple, it made several nearby people gasp audibly. Damien knelt again, eye level with his daughter. Yes, he said, his voice steady despite the tears threatening to fall again. I am. And I'm so sorry I didn't know about you sooner. But I know now, and I'm not going anywhere. Alexander studied him seriously. Mama says being a daddy isn't about biology, it's about showing up. Are you going to show up? Every day, Damien promised. For the rest of my life, I'm going to show up. The children seemed to accept this, their capacity for forgiveness infinite in the way only children could manage. Lily reached out, touching Damien's face with one chocolate-covered hand, leaving a smear across his cheek that would photograph beautifully for tomorrow's society pages. "You can hug us if you want," she said generously. "We give good hugs." Damien pulled them both close, his arms wrapping around his children for the first time, his face a study in wonder and grief and overwhelming love that had nowhere to go but forward. Alexander hugged back fiercely. Lily patted his back like she was comforting him, intuiting that this adult needed gentleness. And Renee stood watching, tears streaming down her face as the family she'd carried alone for 5 years finally included the man who should have been there all along. The room erupted in whispers, in shocked conversations, in the kind of scandal that would dominate every society column for months. But Renee didn't care anymore. The secret was out, the truth was told, and whatever happened next, they'd face it together. All of them. Finally, the silence that followed Damien's embrace of his children lasted exactly 17 seconds. Renee counted, an old habit from when she'd timed contractions alone in a Denver hospital. The ballroom seemed frozen, 500 people suspended between shock and fascination. Watching a drama none of them had anticipated, but all of them would discuss for years. Victoria appeared from nowhere, cutting through the crowd like a shark sensing blood in water. She'd been absent earlier, but now she materialized at the edge of the scene, her face a careful mask that couldn't quite hide the panic beneath. She looked older than Renee remembered, harder somehow, as if the 5 years had worn her down in ways that money and status couldn't repair. "Damien," Victoria said, her voice carrying just enough to reach the immediate circle. "What's going on? Who are these children?" The question was tactical, Renee recognized, asked publicly to force Damien to either lie or reveal the truth in front of witnesses. But Damien didn't flinch. He stood, keeping one hand on Alexander's shoulder, the other on Lily's physically, claiming them in a way that answered Victoria's question without words. "These are my children," he said clearly, his voice carrying across the space that had gone silent to catch every word. "Alexander and Lily. They're 5 years old, and until an hour ago I didn't know they existed." The gasps were audible now, the scandal erupting in real time. Phones appeared from pockets and purses, capturing the moment for social media immortality. The Bloomberg reporter who'd been covering arrivals was frantically typing, live streaming, a scoop that would break every entertainment and business news site within minutes. Victoria's mask cracked completely. "That's impossible. 5 years ago you were with me. We were engaged. You couldn't have—" "I was with Renee," Damien interrupted, his voice steady but hard. "Before you convinced me she wasn't right for me. Before I made the worst mistake of my life by listening to you instead of trusting what I felt." The accusation hung in the air, public and damning. Victoria's face went through several transformations: shock, anger, calculation. When she spoke again, her voice had dropped to something more dangerous. "You're saying she hid your children from you for 5 years, and you're just accepting that? You're not even angry that she kept this from you?" "I'm furious," Damien said quietly, though his hand on Alexander's shoulder remained gentle. "At myself, for creating a situation where the woman carrying my children felt she had to disappear rather than trust me to choose her. For being the kind of man who valued the easy path over the right one." Renee felt something in her chest loosen, not forgiveness exactly, but acknowledgement that he understood, that he wasn't making himself the victim in this story, wasn't demanding sympathy for what he'd lost when he'd been the architect of his own loss. "Perhaps," came a calm voice from behind them, "this conversation would be better continued somewhere private." Renee turned to find an older gentleman she didn't recognize, distinguished, with silver hair, and the kind of presence that suggested authority without demanding it. Caroline appeared at his elbow, murmuring something Renee couldn't hear. "The library is available," the man continued. "Mr. Cross, Miss Carter, I believe the children would be more comfortable away from this." He gestured vaguely at the room full of staring people, phones raised, gossip already spreading like wildfire. Damien nodded gratefully. Thank you, Richard. Yes, the library. They were shepherded through a side door, away from the ballroom chaos, down a corridor lined with art that probably cost more than small countries. The children stayed close to Renee, Alexander's earlier bravery giving way to uncertainty now that adult tensions were becoming more apparent. The library was everything the name suggested: floor-to-ceiling books, leather furniture, a fireplace crackling with real wood. Caroline appeared with juice boxes for the children and water for the adults, then disappeared with the discretion of someone who knew when to be invisible. Victoria had followed them, uninvited, but not asked to leave. She stood near the door, arms crossed, watching the scene with an expression Renee couldn't quite decode. Hurt? Anger? Fear? All of them mixed together into something toxic. Damien settled into a chair, gesturing for the children to sit near him. They chose the floor instead, Alexander building something with decorative bookends, while Lily examined a crystal paperweight with intense focus. The mundane activities of childhood provide counterpoint to adult drama. I need to understand, Damien said, looking at Renee. Not to judge, just to understand. Why didn't you tell me? At any point in 5 years, why didn't you reach out? Renee sat on the couch opposite him, choosing her words carefully. At first, because I was too hurt. You'd chosen Victoria in front of everyone I knew. I was humiliated and pregnant and terrified. Telling you felt like begging you to stay out of obligation. I would have stayed, Damien said quietly. I know. That's why I didn't tell you. I didn't want you to stay out of obligation. I wanted you to choose me because you loved me, not because I was carrying your children. And you'd already proven you didn't love me enough. The words were brutal but necessary. Damien absorbed them with a flinch but didn't argue. Then months passed, and I was alone in Denver, working myself to exhaustion, building something from nothing, and I thought, why should I let you back in now? You had your chance. You made your choice. These babies were mine, the one good thing that came from the worst day of my life. Victoria made a sound, something between a laugh and a sob. So you punished him by keeping his children secret? That's vindictive, Renee. Even for you. I protected them, Renee said sharply, turning to face her former best friend. From a father who might resent their existence, from becoming the obligation that trapped him in a life he didn't choose, from growing up watching their parents hate each other. Instead, they grew up without a father at all, Victoria shot back. You made a choice for all of them based on your hurt feelings. You made a choice for all of us when you decided my fiancé was a prize to be won, Renee replied, her voice cold. When you spent months undermining our relationship, pointing out every flaw, every moment he chose work over me, every sign that maybe we weren't right for each other. Don't pretend this happened in a vacuum, Victoria. You wanted him, and you got him. The children are the consequence of choices we all made. The truth of it seemed to deflate Victoria. She sank into a chair near the door, her composure crumbling. I didn't know you were pregnant. If I'd known, would it have mattered? Renee asked genuinely. Would you have stepped aside? Would you have told Damien before making your move? Victoria's silence was answer enough. Lily looked up from her paperweight, sensing the tension even if she didn't understand the details. Why is everyone sad? Did we do something wrong? The question broke through the adult conflict like sunlight through storm clouds. Damien immediately knelt beside her, his voice gentle. No, sweetheart, you did nothing wrong. The adults made mistakes a long time ago, and now we're trying to fix them. But none of this is your fault or your brother's fault, you understand? Lily nodded solemnly, then returned to her paperweight examination. Children's capacity to accept and move on, to trust that adults would handle adult problems, was both blessing and responsibility. Before we continue, I want to pause and speak directly to you watching this story unfold. If this moment is moving you, if you've ever faced the choice between holding onto hurt or releasing it for your own peace, tap that like button. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that forgiveness isn't about the person who hurt you. It's about freeing yourself from the weight of carrying their mistakes. Your engagement tells us these stories matter, that truth shared becomes strength multiplied. Damien returned to his chair, his attention back on Renee. I can't change the past. I can't undo choosing Victoria, can't recover the 5 years I missed with Alexander and Lily. But I can commit to the future. What do you need from me? What do they need? The question was offered without defense, without excuses, just a genuine desire to understand and repair. Renee had prepared for this conversation, had consulted lawyers and child psychologists, and had planned every contingency. But sitting here, watching Damien interact with their children with such careful tenderness, she found her rehearsed speeches evaporating. Consistency, she said finally. They need you to show up, reliably, not just when it's convenient. Video calls twice a week at minimum, visits every other weekend to start, working up to more as they get comfortable. You don't get to be a Disney dad who appears with presents and disappears when real parenting gets hard. Agreed, Damien said immediately. What else? Therapy. For them to process all this. For us to figure out co-parenting. For you, probably. To deal with whatever drove you to make the choices that led us here. He nodded, accepting each requirement without negotiation. And legally, I need custody agreements that protect them. You have resources I don't. If you wanted to, you could make my life very difficult through the courts. I need guarantees that you won't try to take them from me. Never, Damien said fiercely. They're yours. You raised them, you sacrificed for them, you built their world. I'm asking for the privilege of being included in that world, not demanding to reshape it. The concession was more than Renee had expected, and she felt tears threatening again. Okay. Then we'll work with lawyers, draw up agreements that protect everyone. What about you? The question came quietly, weighted with everything they weren't saying. Is there any possibility of us? Renee looked at him, really looked, seeing not the billionaire who'd broken her heart but the father meeting his children, the man who'd spent 2 hours crying over babies he'd never known existed, the person who was taking responsibility for his failures without making excuses. I don't know, she said honestly. Right now, I can't think about us beyond co-parenting. Maybe someday, when we've proven we can do that successfully, when enough time has passed that I can trust you won't disappear when things get hard. But Damien, you have to understand, you destroyed me 5 years ago. You chose someone else, in the most public, humiliating way possible. Even if you didn't know about the pregnancy, even if Victoria manipulated the situation, you still made that choice, and I've spent 5 years rebuilding myself into someone who doesn't need you. I can't just undo that work because you're sorry. I know, he said, his voice rough. I'm not asking you to. I'm just asking for the chance to prove I can be better. Not for you, necessarily, but for them. And if someday you decide I've earned the right to try again, I'll be grateful. And if you don't, I'll accept that too. The maturity in his response surprised her. This wasn't the man who'd chosen the easy path 5 years ago. Something had changed in him, whether through time, through failed relationships, through the shock of discovering fatherhood, she couldn't say. But the change was evident. Victoria stood abruptly, drawing all eyes. I can't sit here and watch this reunion like I'm supposed to be happy about it. You two destroyed each other, and now you're going to co-parent, and maybe fall in love again, while I'm cast as the villain in your story. You cast yourself, Renee said quietly, by going after a man you knew I loved, by undermining our relationship instead of supporting your best friend, by taking what wasn't yours to take. He chose me, Victoria said, but her voice lacked conviction. Because you made yourself the easier choice, Damien said, his voice tired. Because you told me what I wanted to hear instead of what I needed to hear. Because being with you required nothing of me except money and status, while being with Renee required me to actually be present, to grow, to choose love over ambition. The honesty was brutal. Victoria's face crumpled, and for a moment Renee almost felt sorry for her. Almost. I loved you, Victoria said, looking at Damien. Not perfectly, not well, but I did love you. And you never loved me back, did you? Not really. You just loved that I didn't challenge you. No, Damien agreed quietly. I didn't love you. And I'm sorry for that, for using you as an escape from real feeling. We hurt each other, Victoria. Let's at least be honest about that. She nodded, tears falling freely now. Then she looked at Renee, and something in her expression shifted. I'm sorry, she said, the words seeming to cost her everything, for what I did to you, for taking him when I knew you loved him, for not being the friend you deserved. I can't undo it, but I am sorry. Renee studied her former best friend, seeing genuine remorse beneath the defensive anger. Forgiveness felt too big for this moment, too generous for wounds still fresh. But acknowledgement that she could offer. I believe you're sorry, Renee said carefully. I don't know if that changes anything between us, but I believe you. It wasn't reconciliation, but it was honest. And honesty, Renee had learned, was the only foundation worth building on. Alexander stood up from his bookend construction, walking over to Damien, with the deliberate purpose of someone who'd made a decision. Can I ask you something? Anything, Damien said, giving his son complete attention. Are you going to make Mama cry again? Because if you are, I'd rather you just leave now. She cries enough when she thinks we can't hear. The 5-year-old protectiveness broke something open in the room. Damien's face contorted with grief at the thought of Renee crying over him, over the situation he'd created. I'm going to do everything I can not to, Damien promised. But Alexander, sometimes adults make mistakes even when they're trying hard not to. If I do make your mama cry, I want you to tell me, okay? Because my job is to make her life easier, not harder. And you and your sister can help me with that job by letting me know when I'm getting it wrong. Alexander considered this seriously, then nodded. Okay. But I'm watching you. Good, Damien said, his voice thick with emotion. Someone should be. The tension in the room had shifted, not disappeared, but transformed into something more manageable. The secrets were out. The truths were told. And what remained was the hard work of figuring out how 5 people with shared history and fresh wounds would move forward into an uncertain future. Lily abandoned her paperweight and climbed onto Renee's lap, tired of adult conversations she couldn't fully follow. Can we go home now? I'm sleepy and this party is boring. The simple request from a 5-year-old provided the exit they all needed. Renee nodded, standing with Lily in her arms. Yes, baby. We can go. Damien stood too, looking at his children with naked longing. When can I see you again? Both of you. We're staying at the St. Regis tonight, Renee said. Tomorrow morning, breakfast, 9 o'clock in our suite. No lawyers, no grand gestures. Just breakfast with your kids. I'll be there, Damien promised. 9 o'clock exactly. They moved toward the door, this strange new family configuration that would require years to navigate properly. Victoria remained in the library, watching them leave, her face a study in loss and acceptance combined. At the threshold, Renee turned back. Victoria, for what it's worth, I hope you find whatever it is you're actually looking for, because it was never him. Then they were gone, leaving the library and the gala, and the 500 witnesses behind. Bentley waited where she'd left it, Elena having been summoned by text to meet them with the children's overnight things. As they drove through Manhattan toward the St. Regis, Alexander and Lily both asleep within minutes, Renee allowed herself to feel the full weight of what had happened. The secret was out. Damien knew. The world knew. And tomorrow would begin the complicated process of building a family from ruins. But tonight, watching the city lights blur past, her children safe beside her, Renee felt something she hadn't felt in 5 years. Hope that maybe, possibly, the story didn't end with heartbreak. Maybe it just began there. Morning arrived at the St. Regis with the kind of gentle light that made Manhattan look almost forgiving. Renee woke to find both children already awake, bouncing on the king-sized bed with the restless energy of 5-year-olds who'd slept well and were ready to conquer the day. Is it 9 o'clock yet? Alexander asked for what was probably the 10th time since sunrise. Is he coming? Did he forget? It's 8:15, Renee replied, pulling Lily into a hug before she could bounce herself off the bed entirely. And he's not going to forget. I promise. She'd been awake since 6, her own anxiety making sleep impossible. What if Damien had reconsidered in the cold light of morning? What if the shock had worn off and been replaced by resentment? What if he showed up with lawyers instead of the simple breakfast she'd requested? But at exactly 8:52 a.m., the suite phone rang. The front desk announcing that Mr. Cross was waiting in the lobby, asking permission to come up. 8 minutes early, eager, but trying not to be too eager. The detail made her smile despite her nerves. "Send him up," she told the concierge. The children scrambled to make themselves presentable, Alexander finger-combing his hair while Lily insisted on changing into her fancy dress, the one from last night, now bearing a chocolate stain that no amount of fancy dry cleaning would likely remove. Renee had given up arguing about it after the third iteration of, "But it makes me feel pretty." The knock came at exactly 9 o'clock. Damien Cross, punctual in business and apparently in fatherhood as well. Renee opened the door to find him holding bags from what looked like every bakery in Manhattan: croissants, muffins, Danish pastries, bagels, fruit tarts. His face was uncertain, hopeful, terrified. "I didn't know what they liked," he said by way of greeting, "so I bought everything." The vulnerability in the admission, this billionaire who commanded industries reduced to anxiety about breakfast preferences, made something in Renee's chest loosen. She stepped back, letting him enter their temporary home. The children approached cautiously, yesterday's boldness tempered by sleep and new awareness. This was their father, the man from photographs who'd suddenly become real. The weight of that was evident in their careful movements, their uncertain smiles. "Hi," Lily said quietly. Then, with more confidence, "You brought a lot of food." "Too much, probably," Damien admitted, kneeling to be at their level. "But I thought we could figure out together what you like, and maybe what you don't like. I want to learn everything about you." "We don't like blueberries," Alexander offered. "But we like strawberries and chocolate and Mama's pancakes, but nobody makes them as good as Mama." "Then I'll have to convince your Mama to teach me," Damien said, glancing at Renee with a question in his eyes. They settled around the suite's dining table, an odd little breakfast party that was both incredibly normal and completely surreal. Damien was careful not to overreach, letting the children set the pace, answering their questions with thoughtful honesty. "Why didn't you know about us before?" Lily asked around a mouthful of croissant. Damien looked at Renee, seeking permission for how much truth to share. She nodded slightly. They'd agreed the children deserved honesty, just age-appropriate versions of it. "Because your mama and I had a fight a long time ago, before you were born," Damien explained. "And I made some very bad choices that hurt her feelings. She left New York to start a new life somewhere safer and happier, and she didn't tell me she was going to have you because she thought I might not be a very good daddy." "Are you a good daddy?" Alexander asked, his directness inherited from both parents. "I don't know yet," Damien answered honestly, "but I want to be. I want to learn how to be the best daddy I can be for you. Will you help me learn?" The children considered this seriously, then seemed to reach some wordless agreement that only twins could manage. "Okay," Alexander said, "but you have to come to Denver. That's where we live. And you have to meet our chickens." "You have chickens?" "3, Lily confirmed proudly. "Henrietta, Beatrice, and Steve." "Steve is a boy chicken, but Alexander named him before we knew." The conversation meandered through the topics 5-year-olds found important: chickens, favorite colors, whether dinosaurs could beat dragons in a fight. Damien listened with the intensity of someone memorizing every word, filing away details like they were crucial business intelligence, which, Renee supposed, they were. The intelligence of building relationships with humans who hadn't learned to hide their truths yet. An hour passed, then 2. The breakfast pastries were decimated, leaving crumbs and chocolate smears across the expensive table linens. The children's initial wariness had melted into something approaching comfort, though they still gravitated toward Renee whenever uncertainty struck. "I brought something," Damien said eventually, pulling out his phone. "If it's okay with your mama, I thought maybe we could take a picture. All of us together. So I can remember today." Renee's throat tightened. He was asking permission, recognizing her authority even as he tried to claim his place in their lives. "That would be nice," she managed. They arranged themselves awkwardly on the couch, Damien on one end, Renee on the other, the children between them like a bridge across 5 years of distance. Damien held his phone at arm's length, angling for the shot. "Everyone says family," he suggested. "Family," they chorused, and the camera clicked. Looking at the photo afterward, Renee was struck by how they almost looked like they belonged together. Almost like this had always been the plan, rather than the messy reconstruction of something broken. The children were grinning, chocolate smudged and perfect. Damien looked overwhelmed but happy, and Renee looked tired, hopeful, uncertain. All of it is visible in her expression. "Can I keep this as my phone background?" Damien asked quietly. "I know that's probably—" "Yes," Renee said. "They should be your background. They should be front and center in your life now." The afternoon unfolded with surprising ease. Damien had cleared his entire day, unprecedented for a man whose assistant usually scheduled him in 15-minute increments. They walked through Central Park, the children running ahead while the adults navigated the strange new territory of KO parenting conversations. "I've been thinking about the logistics," Damien said. "Denver is 2 hours by plane. I could fly out every Friday evening, stay until Sunday night. Or they could come here some weekends, once they're comfortable with that." "That's a lot of flying," Renee observed. "I have a plane. Several, actually. And I'd fly around the world twice a week if that's what it took to be in their lives." The commitment in his voice was real. Renee wanted to believe it would last, that he wouldn't tire of the inconvenience once the novelty wore off. But only time would prove that, and she'd learned not to make assumptions about Damien Cross's staying power. They stopped at a playground, watching Alexander and Lily navigate the equipment, with the fearless confidence of children who'd been encouraged to be brave. Other parents gave them curious looks. They clearly weren't a typical family unit. The careful distance between the adults suggesting complication, while the children's ease suggested connection. "Thank you," Damien said suddenly, "for raising them so well, for making them brave and kind and secure despite doing it alone. I know I have no right to that gratitude, that you did what you had to do, but thank you anyway." Renee felt tears threatening. "You're welcome. But Damien, understand, I didn't do it for you. I did it for them and for me. They saved my life as much as I built theirs." "Still," he insisted, "you gave them something I couldn't have given them 5 years ago. Presence, consistency, unconditional love. I was too consumed with building an empire to understand that none of it mattered without people to share it with. Do you understand that now?" she asked. "Or is this just the guilt talking?" He considered the question seriously. Both, maybe. The guilt is real, but so is the understanding. Losing you was the catalyst for realizing I'd optimized my life for all the wrong variables. Breaking up with Victoria confirmed it, and now, knowing about Alexander and Lily, getting this unexpected chance to be their father. I'm not going to waste it chasing quarterly earnings and market dominance. People don't change overnight, Damien. No, he agreed, but they can change direction overnight and spend years following the new path. That's what I'm asking for. The chance to prove the direction has changed, even if the transformation takes time. They were interrupted by Lily's shriek, not fear, but delight as Alexander pushed her on the swing higher than she'd ever gone before. Both children were laughing, uncomplicated joy that reminded the adults what they were actually fighting for. That evening, Damien joined them for dinner at a small Italian place 3 blocks from the hotel. Not the kind of restaurant he usually frequented. No Michelin stars. No celebrity chef, just good food and red-checkered tablecloths. The children made disasters with their spaghetti, sauce ending up on their faces and clothes and the table. Damien laughed more than Renee had heard him laugh in all the time she'd known him. Genuine amusement at the chaos. "To new beginnings," he said, raising his water glass when the children were distracted by dessert menus. Renee clinked her glass against his carefully. "To second chances. May we all deserve the grace we've been given." The toast felt important, a marker of this strange day when strangers became family and enemies became allies in the shared project of raising children who deserved better than their parents' mistakes. Later, back at the suite, with the children bathed and in pajamas despite Their protests that they weren't tired, Damien prepared to leave. The goodbye was awkward, none of them quite sure of the protocol for this new relationship configuration. "When will we see you again?" Alexander asked, voicing the question that hung unspoken. "Friday," Damien promised. "I'll fly to Denver Friday afternoon. Maybe we can have dinner? And Saturday I thought we could go somewhere fun. Your mama can help me figure out what fun looks like in Denver." "The aquarium," Lily suggested immediately. "And the museum with the dinosaurs. And the park with the big slides." "All of that," Damien agreed. "Whatever you want." He hugged them goodbye, the embrace lasting longer than strictly necessary. Like he was trying to memorize the feel of his children in his arms. Then he looked at Renee, uncertainty written across his face. "Thank you for today," he said. "For letting me in. For not making this harder than it had to be. They deserve to know you," Renee replied. "That was never in question. How we navigate everything else, we'll figure that out as we go. And us." The question was quiet, almost afraid. "Ask me again in 6 months," she said. "After you've proven this isn't just novelty. After you've shown up for the boring weekends and the sick days and the tantrums. Ask me when being their father is just life instead of an adventure. Then we'll talk about ourselves." He nodded, accepting the boundary. 6 months. I can work with that. After he left, Renee tucked the children into bed, reading 3 stories as required by Lily's strict protocols. They were asleep within minutes, exhausted by the emotional weight of the day, even if they couldn't articulate it. Alone in the suite's living room, Renee pulled out her phone, scrolling through the photos from the day, her children with their father, learning from each other, building something from nothing. It wasn't the family she'd imagined 5 years ago. It was messier, more complicated, constructed from ruins rather than built on solid ground. But watching Alexander's face light up when Damien had understood his dinosaur explanation, seeing Lily hold Damien's hand while crossing the street, these small moments suggested that maybe, possibly, they could build something real from this unexpected second chance. Her phone buzzed. A text from Damien. "Thank you for today. For them. For the possibility of redemption. Sleep well." She responded simply, "See you Friday. Don't be late." "Never again," he replied. "I promise." Promises were cheap, Renee knew. Actions over time. Those were the currency that mattered. But tonight, watching her children sleep peacefully in a city that had once destroyed her, she allowed herself to hope that some promises might actually be kept. The story wasn't over. It was just beginning a new chapter, one where the heroine didn't ride off into the sunset alone, but instead navigated the complicated terrain of co-parenting with a man who'd broken her heart but might, possibly, eventually learn to deserve the family he'd never known he'd lost. Tomorrow they'd fly back to Denver. Next Friday, Damien will come to them. And slowly, carefully, they'd build a new normal from the scattered pieces of their separate lives. It wasn't perfect, but perfect, Renee had learned, was overrated. Real was better. Honesty was better. And second chances, properly handled, might be the best thing of all. 6 months later, sunrise over Denver painted the Rockies in shades of rose gold and amber, transforming the world into something almost impossibly beautiful. Renee stood at the kitchen window of her Colorado home, coffee warming her hands, watching the morning claim the sky. While behind her, chaos reigned in the particular way it only could when Damien Cross attempted to make pancakes. "I think the griddle is supposed to be less hot," Alexander observed from his perch on the counter, offering commentary with the authority of someone who'd watched his mother perform this task hundreds of times. "The recipe doesn't specify temperature," Damien replied, flipping a pancake that was definitely too dark on one side. "It just says medium heat." "Mama's medium and your medium are different mediums," Lily added helpfully, not looking up from the elaborate table setting she was creating. She'd decided that Sunday breakfast required cloth napkins and fancy plates. Never mind that they were about to eat slightly burned pancakes. Renee smiled into her coffee, letting the scene wash over her. 6 months of every other weekend visits had transformed her home in ways she couldn't have predicted. Damien's expensive luggage now had a permanent spot in the guest room. His preferred coffee blend sat next to hers in the pantry. The children's bathroom contained 2 toothbrushes in their favorite colors, purchased by a father learning the small details that constituted care. It hadn't been perfect. There'd been the weekend Damien had missed because of a board crisis did initially prioritized over a promised trip to the Children's Museum. The phone call where Renee had quietly, firmly reminded him that being a father meant sometimes the board waited. He'd caught the next flight out, arriving 6 hours late, but arriving nonetheless, and he hadn't made that mistake again. There'd been the tantrum, Alexander's spectacular meltdown over something trivial that was really about testing whether this new father would stay when things got hard. Damien had handled it badly at first, trying to logic away emotions that didn't respond to logic. But he'd called Renee afterward, asked for help understanding, listened when she'd explained that. Sometimes children just needed to feel their feelings while adults held space for the chaos. He'd learned, slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely. The man flipping burned pancakes in her kitchen wasn't the same person who'd chosen Victoria 5 years ago. That man had been running from anything that required emotional availability. This man was running toward it, even when it was messy and complicated and occasionally involved smoke alarms triggered by overzealous breakfast preparation. "I think we might need to order takeout," Damien admitted, surveying the collection of variously burned pancakes accumulating on the plate. "We're eating your pancakes," Lily declared loyally, "even if they're crunchy." The fierce defense made Damien's face do something complicated, pride and love and overwhelming gratitude mixed together. He'd confessed to Renee during one of their late-night conversations after the children were asleep that he'd never expected to be loved unconditionally by anyone. His parents had loved him, but with expectations attached. Victoria had loved the idea of him, but his children just loved him. Burned pancakes and bad jokes and awkward attempts at fatherhood included. Elena appeared from the guest house, letting herself in with the familiarity of family. She'd been skeptical of Damien initially, watching him with the protective wariness of someone who'd seen. Renee rebuilt herself from nothing and wouldn't tolerate anyone threatening that hard-won stability. But even she had softened, won over by his consistent presence and genuine effort. "The pancakes are burned," she observed, accepting coffee from Renee. "We're eating them anyway," Alexander reported, "because love is more important than perfect pancakes." The statement, delivered with 5-year-old solemnity, made all the adults pause. Renee met Damien's eyes across the kitchen, seeing her own emotion reflected there. Somehow, despite their mistakes and complications, they'd managed to teach the children something true. They ate breakfast together. The burned pancakes declared actually kind of good if you use enough syrup by Lily. Conversation flowed easily. The children's upcoming school performance, Damien's upcoming business trip, that he'd scheduled around visitation, Renee's new collection that would debut next month in Paris. "I want to be there," Damien said, "for the Paris show. Not as a business contact, just as someone who's proud of what you've built. If that's okay." It was a question, not an assumption. 6 months had taught him to ask rather than assume, to respect her autonomy even as they built connection. "I'd like that," Renee admitted. "The children are coming too. Elena's making it a whole production. We're going to see the Eiffel Tower," Alexander added, "and eat croissants in France, which are probably better than the ones here." "Definitely better," Damien agreed seriously. "It's basically the law." After breakfast, they took the children to the park, the same one they'd visited dozens of times, where the familiarity allowed the kids to run ahead while the adults walked at a slower pace, talking through the logistics and emotions of their unusual arrangement. "I've been thinking," Damien said carefully, "about something more permanent." "Not us," he added quickly, reading her expression. "I know we're not there yet, maybe never will be, but something for the children, a foundation maybe in their names, to help other single parents like you were, like so many others are. Free childcare, business training, seed funding, mentorship, everything that might have made your journey less brutal." Renee stopped walking, turning to face him fully. "A foundation?" The Alexander and Lily Foundation for Single Parents and Emerging Entrepreneurs, he said, pulling out his tablet to show her architectural renderings of a building complex, free childcare, workshops, innovation labs. Everything you needed 5 years ago that didn't exist. I want to build it, fund it, but I want you to design the programs. Because you know what actually works versus wealthy people's fantasies about poverty. The plans were detailed, thoughtful, clearly representing months of work. Renee felt tears threatening as she scrolled through page after page of programming, designed to lift people up rather than just make donors feel good about themselves. Why their names? She asked quietly. Because they changed everything for me. Because knowing them exists has made me want to do something meaningful with resources I didn't earn through. Virtue. Because if other children can have what they had, a mother willing to sacrifice everything for their well-being, then maybe we can change some lives. It was the most articulate expression of purpose Renee had ever heard from him. The foundation wasn't about tax breaks or legacy. It was about transformation, about turning his belated understanding of what mattered into tangible help for people still struggling. I'm in, she said, but I want half the board to be people who've actually experienced single parenthood. Not just people who write checks. Already planned for, Damien replied, showing her the proposed board structure. You, me, Elena, and 6 others, all of whom built something from nothing while raising children alone. They spent the next hour discussing details while the children played, building the framework for something that might outlast both of them. This was legacy, Renee realized. Not the fashion empire or the business holdings, but the impact they could have on lives still being lived, still struggling, still hoping. That afternoon, back at the house, Renee received the call she'd been waiting for. The acquisition was complete. Her family's company, the one Victoria had nearly destroyed, was officially hers again. RC International had reclaimed what had been stolen. But instead of satisfaction, Renee felt mostly relief. The revenge she'd imagined 5 years ago had lost its appeal somewhere along the way. Now it was just business, just reclaiming what should have been hers all along. Congratulations, Damien said when she shared the news. How does it feel? Anticlimactic, she admitted. I thought it would feel like victory. Instead, it just feels like closing a circle. Maybe that's better than victory, he suggested. Maybe closure is what you actually needed. That evening, after dinner and baths and the elaborate bedtime routine the children required, Renee and Damien sat on the back porch while Elena supervised final story time. The mountains loomed in the distance, constant and indifferent to human drama. You ask me to ask again in 6 months, Damien said quietly. About us. Renee had known this was coming and had been preparing her answer for weeks. I know, so I'm asking, not for promises or commitments, just, is there a possibility? Can you ever see yourself trusting me more than co-parenting? She looked at him, really looked, seeing not the man who'd broken her heart, but the father who'd shown up every other weekend for 6 months, who'd learned to make terrible pancakes because the children thought it was funny, who'd rescheduled board meetings and turned down acquisition opportunities because being present mattered more. I don't know, she said honestly. You've proven you can be a good father, but being a good partner requires different things, and I'm not sure either of us knows how to be that for each other. We failed spectacularly the first time. We were different people the first time, Damien countered. I was running from intimacy. You were accepting less than you deserved. We've both grown, maybe, Renee acknowledged. But Damien, I'm happy now. Genuinely happy. I have my children, my business, my life exactly as I built it. Getting involved with you again risks that stability, and I'm not sure the potential gain is worth the certain risk. The rejection was gentle but firm. Damien absorbed it with visible disappointment, but also acceptance. Okay, he said simply. Thank you for being honest. But, Renee continued, surprising herself, ask me again in another 6 months. Let's see if this consistency continues. Let's see if you can be present, not just for the children, but for yourself. If you can build a life that includes them rather than squeezing them into gaps between business demands. And let's see if I can learn to trust again, if I can risk the vulnerability that loving you would require. So not no, just not yet. Not yet, she confirmed. Maybe never. But maybe eventually. Time will tell. It wasn't the declaration Damien clearly hoped for, but it was honest. And honesty, they'd both learned, was the only foundation worth building on. Before we close this chapter of Renee's story, I want to speak directly to you, our incredible Mr. Steele Rich Stories family. Thank you for being part of this journey, for witnessing one woman's transformation from heartbreak to triumph. These stories only matter because you take the time to watch, to engage, to share them with others who might need to. Hear that survival is possible, that redemption is real, that second chances exist for those brave enough to seize them. If this story touched you, if Renee's strength inspired you, if you believe in the power of forgiveness and the possibility of new beginnings, hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs to know they can rebuild from ruins, and subscribe to join our family of storytellers who believe that truth, even when it's painful, is always worth telling. The next morning, Damien's flight back to New York left at 11. The children hugged him goodbye with the casual affection of people who knew he'd return, who'd stopped treating his departures as abandonments and started treating them as temporary absences. Progress, Renee thought, watching them. See you in 2 weeks, Damien said, hugging Alexander and Lily one more time. And we'll video call Tuesday and Thursday like always. Bring better pancake skills next time, Alexander suggested. I'll practice, Damien promised solemnly. Then he turned to Renee, and for a moment, they were just two people who'd loved each other once, who'd destroyed each other once, who were carefully building something new from the wreckage. Thank you, he said quietly, for the possibility, for not slamming the door completely, for letting me prove I can be better. Thank you for showing up, she replied. Consistently, even when it's hard. He left, and the house felt both emptier and more complete somehow. The children returned to their normal routines, school and playdates and the comfortable rhythm of the life Renee had built. But now that life included phone calls where they told their father about their days, weekends, where he was present, included the slow construction of family from unconventional materials. 3 months later, the Alexander and Lily Foundation opened its doors. In Denver, with satellite locations planned for 6 other cities, the opening ceremony featured speeches from single parents who'd already benefited from the programs, their stories of transformation echoing Renee's own journey in ways that made her weep. Damien attended, bringing the children, watching with visible emotion as the foundation, bearing his children's names, began its work of changing lives. This is what wealth is for, he said to Renee during the reception. Not accumulating more, but leveraging what you have to create opportunity for others. You've changed, she observed. Being a father changes you, he replied simply. Knowing them exists makes me want to leave a world worth inheriting. 6 months after that conversation on the porch, almost a year since, the Thanksgiving gala that had changed everything, Damien asked again. They were in Paris, watching the children chase pigeons near the Eiffel Tower after Renee's triumphant fashion show, and he simply said, "Is it still not yet?" Renee watched her children laugh, watched this man who'd learned to be their father, and felt something shift in her chest. Not the wild, desperate love of their first relationship, but something quieter, steadier, built on shared purpose and proven consistency. "Ask me to dinner," she said. "Just the 2 of us. No children, no business, no history. Just 2 people seeing if they enjoy each other's company without all the weight we carry." Damien's face transformed with hope so naked it almost hurt to witness. "Tomorrow night? I know a place with terrible lighting and mediocre wine." "Perfect," Renee said, and meant it. The story didn't end there, because real stories never really end. They just evolve, transform, continue in ways that can't be predicted or controlled. Renee and Damien would have that dinner, and many others after. Sometimes they'd feel like a couple rebuilding what was broken. Sometimes they'd feel like strangers learning from each other fresh. But always, they'd be Alexander and Lily's parents, committed to raising children who understood. That love was action, that family was choice, that forgiveness was strength rather than weakness. And the twins, growing up watching their parents navigate complicated, Grace would learn that second chances were real, that mistakes didn't have to be permanent, that sometimes the story broken in the middle could find a different ending than anyone expected. Years later, when Alexander and Lily were older and asked about how their family came to be, Renee would tell them the truth, that love was messy and imperfect, that adults made terrible mistakes, that sometimes people had to lose everything to understand what actually mattered. But she'd also tell them that redemption was possible, that forgiveness could coexist with boundaries, that showing up, day after day, even when it was hard, was the truest form of love there was. The city that broke her had taught her to build herself stronger. The man who abandoned her had learned to show up. And the children who existed because of heartbreak had become the reason for healing. That was a legacy. Not the empire, not the foundation, not the wealth or success or any of it. Just love, practiced imperfectly but genuinely, by people who'd learned that second chances were gifts that required gratitude and effort in equal measure. The story paused here, but it didn't end. It simply continued, one day at a time, one choice at a time, one moment of grace building, on the last until it resembled something worth having, worth keeping, worth fighting for. And that, in the end, was enough.